At his housewarming party, my son threw my late wife's handmade quilt directly into the fireplace. He told his wealthy guests that trash did not belong in his mansion. I pulled it out of the flames with my bare hands. When I took the scorched fabric to the seamstress anyway, her hands started trembling. She asked if I knew what was sewn inside it. My name is Harlan Wright. I am 69 years old and I am still recovering from the wounds my own flesh and blood caused. As a retired steelworker, I built my life on solid foundations, but I recently discovered my family was built on a lie. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The air inside the new estate felt incredibly thin. I stood near the massive marble pillars of the grand foyer wearing my best charcoal suit. It was the same suit I wore to bury my wife Sylvia 3 years ago. The house was a sprawling modern monstrosity of glass and steel purchased to celebrate my son Jared, making partner at his investment firm. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated with silver trays of expensive champagne. I reached for a glass, but a manicured hand intercepted the waiter before he could reach me. It was Natalie, Jared's wife. She wore a shimmering emerald gown that cost more than my first car. Her blonde hair was pinned back sharply, matching the harsh lines of her perfectly contoured face. She smiled, but her pale blue eyes were entirely devoid of warmth. She steered the waiter away from me and gestured toward the far corner of the room near the swinging kitchen doors. She told me I would be much more comfortable out of the main thoroughfare. She claimed the prominent guests, the city officials, and wealthy hedge fund managers needed space to network without distractions. I watched her glide across the Italian marble floor, linking arms with a city councilman. She introduced Jared to the elite crowd, completely ignoring my existence. She treated my presence like a muddy footprint on her pristine white carpets. I was the dark, calloused reminder of a past they were both desperately trying to erase. She actively formed a physical barrier between me and a group of investors discussing real estate portfolios. I stepped back into the shadows of the hallway, feeling the familiar sting of rejection. The clinking of crystal glasses and the hum of privileged laughter echoed around me, creating an impenetrable wall of social status. I held a large, carefully wrapped box against my chest. From my isolated corner, I observed the opulent decor. Abstract paintings hung on the stark white walls, and a massive chandelier dominated the vaulted ceiling. My hands throbbed with a dull, familiar ache as I gripped the wrapped box. The joints in my fingers were permanently swollen, thickened by decades of brutal physical labor. I spent 35 years working the blast furnaces at the regional steel mill. I worked consecutive double shifts, breathing in metallic dust and sweat just to make sure Jared never had to experience that kind of exhaustion. Sylvia and I lived in a modest 3-bedroom house with a leaky roof so we could afford his elite private school tuition. We paid for his entire university education in cash, sacrificing our own comfort so he could walk across that graduation stage with a clean slate. He graduated without a single dollar of student loan debt, stepping into his corporate life completely unburdened. Every polished surface in this new mansion was bought with the cartilage and bone of my youth and with the quiet, persistent thriftiness of my late wife. Jared stood near the roaring gas fireplace, laughing loudly at a joke made by a venture capitalist. He wore a custom navy suit and a watch that reflected the firelight. He looked entirely comfortable in this world of wealth and excess. He did not look like the boy who used to sit at my kitchen table struggling with his math homework. He looked like a stranger who had simply absorbed our sacrifices and transformed them into pure arrogance. The heat from the massive stone fireplace radiated across the room. It reminded me of the open furnace doors at the mill. I walked forward. It was time to give them my gift. The conversations died down as I approached the center of the room. The wealthy guests turned their heads, their eyes sweeping over my worn shoes and outdated suit. I stopped directly in front of Jared and Natalie. I held out the box. I told Jared I brought something to warm his new home. He took the box with a hesitant smile. Natalie leaned in, her perfectly painted lips curling into a look of absolute disdain. Jared tore away the wrapping paper and opened the cardboard lid. He pulled out the heavy, intricately stitched quilt. Sylvia had spent her final months sewing it, matching vibrant pieces of fabric into a stunning sunburst pattern despite her failing health and waning energy. She stitched her very soul into those seams, praying it would one day sit on our son's bed. It was a masterpiece of love and profound patience. Natalie let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut through the silent room like a serrated blade. She loudly announced to her high society friends that she did not run a charity shop. She asked Jared why his father was bringing dirty rags into their newly decorated living room. The guests chuckled softly, whispering to one another behind their champagne flutes. Jared's face flushed deep red. Desperate to appease his wife and salvage his image in front of his investors, his expression hardened into something cruel. He snatched the heavy quilt from the box. He turned around and threw the fabric directly into the roaring gas fireplace. The flames instantly caught the edges of the cotton. Jared looked at me with cold, furious eyes. He declared firmly that trash did not belong in his mansion. The sight of Sylvia's final creation burning destroyed my restraint. I lunged past the startled guests and plunged my bare hands directly into the roaring flames. The searing heat bit deeply into my skin. I grabbed the thickest part of the fabric and violently yanked the quilt out of the fire. The burning edges smoldered against the expensive marble floor. I stomped out the flames with my heavy boots. The room erupted into gasps of genuine horror. Jared immediately signaled for the private security guards standing near the grand entrance. He ordered them to escort his injured father off the property before I ruined the entire evening. The guards grabbed my arms and pulled me out into the cold night air. They shoved me toward the gravel driveway. I stumbled to my old pickup truck and sat behind the steering wheel. My palms and fingers were blistering, throbbing with intense, agonizing pain. I rested the ruined, blackened quilt on my lap, my chest heaving with exertion and heartbreak. As I traced the surviving fabric to assess the damage, my burned fingers brushed against something completely unexpected. Deep within the unburned center lining, shielded by layers of dense batting, I felt a rigid, rectangular object securely sewn into the heavy cotton. It was perfectly hidden, entirely invisible to the naked eye. I stared down at the rigid shape concealed within the scorched fabric of the quilt. My blistered palms throbbed with a relentless burning rhythm against the worn leather steering wheel of my truck. The emergency room doctor had wrapped my hands in thick white gauze just an hour prior, warning me to keep them completely immobilized to prevent severe infection. I ignored his advice the moment I walked out of the clinic doors. I needed to know what Sylvia had hidden inside her final creation, but my bandaged, swollen fingers entirely lacked the fine motor skills required to safely dismantle the complex patchwork. I started the engine and drove straight past my neighborhood, heading directly toward the older industrial side of the city. I parked in front of a small, brightly lit storefront bearing the name Rosa Flores Tailoring. Rosa was a master seamstress who had worked side by side with Sylvia for over 15 years at the downtown textile factory. When Sylvia retired, she spent countless afternoons in this very shop, trading fabric scraps and sharing stories with Rosa over bitter black coffee. I pushed the glass door open, triggering a familiar brass bell that echoed through the quiet room. Rosa looked up from her heavy sewing machine. Her warm smile instantly faltered when she saw my bandaged hands and the soot-stained bundle tucked under my arm. I placed the ruined quilt gently onto her cutting table. The smell of burnt cotton filled the small space immediately. I asked her to open the center seam without damaging whatever rested inside. I explained that I felt a solid object hidden beneath the batting, something placed there entirely by design. Rosa did not ask any unnecessary questions about the fire or my injuries. She ran her experienced hands over the charred edges of the sunburst pattern, her dark eyes reflecting a sudden profound sorrow. She whispered Sylvia's name like a prayer before reaching for a pair of heavy surgical shears. I watched in absolute silence as she skillfully navigated the ruined seam, slicing through the heavy cotton thread with practiced precision. As she worked, she began to speak in a hushed, reverent tone. She told me that Sylvia had visited this exact shop just 1 week before her heart finally gave out. I stood paralyzed by the revelation. During that final week, Sylvia had been incredibly weak, barely able to walk from the living room to the kitchen without losing her breath. I had believed she was resting in bed while I worked my final shifts at the steel mill. Rosa explained that Sylvia had arrived in a private taxi carrying this unfinished quilt and a thick roll of cash. She had presented Rosa with a sheet of industrial-grade fireproof polymer lining the exact kind used in advanced aerospace manufacturing. Sylvia had paid Rosa to sew that indestructible lining directly into the center of the heirloom. She made Rosa swear on her life never to mention the alteration to me or to Jared. Rosa's voice cracked as she confessed that Sylvia possessed a chilling clarity that day. Sylvia had told her that the quilt would eventually face destruction, and the lining was the only way to ensure her final message survived the flames. I leaned heavily against the wooden counter, my mind reeling from the weight of my wife's hidden foresight. Sylvia had always possessed a brilliant calculating mind honed by her decades working as a senior compliance auditor for a massive commercial real estate firm. She understood the dark, intricate webs of property law and human greed better than most corporate attorneys. Even as her body failed her, her mind had been actively constructing a fortress. Rosa snipped the last binding thread and peeled back the blackened layers of cotton and wool. Beneath the charred remnants lay the pristine silver-colored polymer lining, completely untouched by the fire that had consumed the rest of the fabric. Rosa separated the thick layers of the aerospace fabric. Her hands suddenly began to tremble violently. She reached into the cavity and extracted a sealed waterproof pouch. She placed it onto the table between us and stepped back, wiping tears from her cheeks. The pouch was heavy and entirely opaque. I awkwardly manipulated my bandaged fingers to grip the waterproof seal. I tore the top edge open, pulling the plastic apart with my teeth when my thumbs refused to bend. The contents slid out onto the polished wood of the cutting table with a heavy metallic clatter. I stared at the 3 items resting before me. The first was a secure encrypted digital flash drive encased in reinforced titanium. The second was a solid brass safe deposit key stamped with a distinct serial number that I recognized immediately. The final item was a thick cream-colored envelope sealed with red wax. My name was written across the front of the envelope in Sylvia's unmistakable, elegant cursive. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. These were not the sentimental keepsakes of a dying woman. These were the deliberate, calculated tools of a whistleblower leaving behind a trail of highly sensitive evidence. Rosa turned away to give me privacy, pretending to organize spools of thread on the far wall. I picked up the envelope, my heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. I slid a letter opener beneath the wax seal, slicing the thick paper open with a single definitive motion. I unfolded the thick parchment paper. Sylvia's neat handwriting immediately shattered every illusion I held about my son. She wrote that she loved me deeply, but she could no longer protect me from the harsh reality of Jared's character. The letter stated clearly that Jared had been compromised by a severe, incurable greed. Sylvia warned me that his ambition had entirely consumed his moral compass, transforming him into a man willing to sacrifice his own family for the illusion of elite social standing. She explicitly instructed me not to confront him or ask him any questions about his finances. Instead, she directed me to take the brass key to the First National Bank on Elm Street the very next morning. The final sentence of the letter was underlined twice in thick black ink. It commanded me to open the safe deposit box before Jared could attempt to finalize the legal purchase of his new mansion. I carefully folded the letter and tucked the brass key into my chest pocket. My burned hands no longer ached. The physical pain had been completely replaced by a freezing, absolute clarity. I gathered the encrypted drive and thanked Rosa for her unwavering loyalty. I walked out into the cold night air, finally understanding that my wife had initiated a silent adjustment, and it was now my duty to finish it. The morning air carried a sharp chill as I parked my old truck in front of the First National Bank on Elm Street. I walked through the heavy glass doors precisely as the lobby opened for business. My freshly bandaged hands drew brief, curious glances from the tellers behind the counter, but I kept my posture rigidly straight. I approached the main desk and asked to speak directly with Mr. Abernathy, the senior branch manager. He had managed our modest checking accounts for over 2 decades. Mr. Abernathy stepped out of his corner office with a welcoming but deeply concerned expression. He ushered me into his private workspace and closed the door tightly to ensure our absolute privacy. I reached into my chest pocket and placed the solid brass key on the polished mahogany desk. Mr. Abernathy stared at the key and let out a heavy, tired sigh. He informed me that the safe deposit box belonged to a highly secure tier requiring dual verification. As he prepared the necessary authorization forms, his hands hesitated over the keyboard. He paused and looked at me with genuine apprehension. He stated that he felt morally and legally obligated to inform me about an unsettling incident that occurred just 3 days prior. My son had scheduled an urgent private meeting in this very office. Jared had presented a preliminary medical document and formally requested an immediate freeze on all accounts connected to Sylvia. Jared claimed my mental faculties were rapidly declining due to intense grief, and that I was financially vulnerable to outside manipulation. He wanted full conservatorship over the entire estate to protect our assets from my supposed erratic behavior. I sat perfectly still in the heavy leather chair. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal washed over me like freezing water. Jared was not simply embarrassed by my presence at his lavish housewarming party. He was actively laying the legal groundwork to strip away my independence and seize whatever meager funds he believed Sylvia had left behind. He had weaponized my grief to build a false clinical narrative of dementia. I looked Mr. Abernathy directly in the eye and spoke with absolute clarity. I assured him my mind was sharper than it had ever been. He nodded in silent agreement, noting my steady demeanor. He officially processed the brass key and escorted me toward the heavy steel doors of the main vault. The lock clicked open with a heavy metallic thud. The metallic echo of the vault door closing sealed me in perfect isolation. I pulled the long metal drawer from its designated slot and carried it carefully to a small viewing table in the center of the room. I expected to find a few sentimental items, perhaps some old family photographs or a modest cash reserve set aside for emergencies. Instead, the box contained a meticulously organized, incredibly thick stack of certified legal documents bound by heavy rubber bands. I lifted the heavy files, my bandaged hands protesting the sheer weight of the paperwork. Every single page was heavily annotated in Sylvia's distinct, precise handwriting. For over 30 years, my wife had worked as a senior compliance auditor for one of the largest commercial real estate firms in the state. She possessed a brilliant, deeply analytical mind. She spent her entire career hunting down hidden liabilities, exposing fraudulent property developers, and dismantling complex financial webs designed to hide dirty money. She understood the intricate loopholes of local property law far better than the high-priced corporate attorneys who frequently sought her expert counsel. While I poured my physical sweat into the steel mill to pay for Jared's tuition, Sylvia quietly analyzed the ruthless mechanics of wealth accumulation. She never brought her work home, choosing instead to leave the corporate ruthlessness at the office to maintain the peace of our household. I realized now that she had secretly utilized her profound expertise to build an invisible legal fortress around our family. She had mapped out every possible vulnerability years in advance. I placed the massive stack of documents carefully into my leather satchel, knowing the true battle had just begun. I drove straight from the bank to the downtown public library to seek out the truth. I needed a secure, entirely untraceable computer to access the encrypted digital drive Rosa had extracted from the burned quilt. I reserved a workstation in the quietest, most isolated corner of the reference section. I plugged the titanium-encased drive into the terminal and entered the complex access password Sylvia had provided in her handwritten letter. A series of heavily encrypted folders instantly populated the glowing screen. I opened the master file prominently labeled with Jared's full legal name. The digital documents perfectly matched the physical copies I had retrieved from the vault just an hour ago. I read through the initial property deeds, and a staggering truth immediately materialized before my eyes. 5 years ago, Sylvia had quietly executed a massive real estate transaction through an untraceable blind trust she established offshore. She had purchased a highly coveted, sprawling 20-acre parcel of undeveloped land in the most exclusive zip code of the entire district. She utilized decades of strategic hidden investments to pay for the land entirely in cash, leaving no paper trail leading back to our modest home. It was the exact parcel of land where Jared had just finished building his opulent new mansion. Sylvia legally owned the very ground my son was standing on. She had deliberately allowed him to construct a multi-million-dollar monument to his own ego on property she exclusively controlled from the shadows. I frantically cross-referenced the land acquisition dates with Jared's corporate loan applications available in the digital folder. The layers of deception became breathtakingly clear. Jared fully believed he had purchased the premium lot from an anonymous foreign developer eager to liquidate regional assets. He had absolutely no idea the anonymous seller holding all the leverage was his own mother acting through a corporate proxy. I scrolled down to the final page of the digital purchase agreement. A cold fury gripped my chest, tightening my breathing. In order to secure the massive construction loans required to build his sprawling mansion, Jared needed the seller to authorize a preliminary transfer of deed to the bank. The document displayed Jared's flamboyant signature alongside the seller's formal authorization. The seller's signature was legally supposed to be Sylvia's, acting as the trust director. I stared at the glowing screen in absolute sickening disbelief. The signature was a blatant, sloppy forgery of my late wife's name. Worse still, the fraudulent document was officially dated and notarized exactly 4 months after Sylvia had passed away. My son had not merely stolen from his family, he had committed severe federal fraud and desecrated his mother's legacy to finance his pathetic illusion of grandeur. The drive from the downtown public library to my modest suburban neighborhood felt like navigating through a thick, suffocating fog. The revelation of the forged trust documents burned in my mind, eclipsing the physical agony of my blistered hands. I had expected to return to the quiet comfort of my sanctuary, a place where I could safely process the massive fraud I had just uncovered. I needed the silence of the house I had fully paid off decades ago, with the sweat equity of a steelworker. Instead, as I turned my old truck onto my street, I spotted an unfamiliar, expensive silver sedan parked squarely in my driveway. I stepped out of my vehicle, my boots heavy on the concrete, and walked through my unlocked front door. I immediately noticed a stranger standing in the exact center of my living room. A man in a sharp-tailored suit was holding a laser measurement tool, carefully noting the dimensions of the brick fireplace I had built with my own hands. I demanded to know who he was and how he had gained unauthorized entry into a private residence. The stranger casually turned around and introduced himself as a commercial real estate appraiser. He explained with alarming nonchalance that he had been granted full access by the prospective sellers to evaluate the property for an expedited market listing. A cold, heavy knot tightened in my stomach. I had lived in this house for 40 years and had never once considered selling the property. The appraiser pointed toward the kitchen, stating that the owners were waiting there with the preliminary paperwork. I walked down the narrow hallway, bracing myself for a confrontation. I expected to find opportunistic intruders, but the reality was far more insulting. My son Jared and his wife Natalie were sitting at my kitchen table, conducting themselves with the brazen entitlement of conquering royalty. Natalie was delicately sipping sparkling water from one of Sylvia's vintage crystal glasses, her eyes scanning the modest kitchen cabinetry with thinly veiled disgust. Jared was sorting through a thick stack of legal folders, completely unbothered by my sudden appearance. Seeing Jared sitting there acting with such supreme, unearned authority triggered a vivid memory in my mind. Decades ago, during Jared's sophomore year of high school, I received a troubling call from his academic counselor. Jared had intercepted his failing report cards in the mail and expertly forged my signature to hide his abysmal grades from me. At the time, I blamed myself for his deception. I assumed my long, grueling double shifts at the steel mill had made me an absent father driving my teenage son to desperate performative anxiety. I had completely forgiven the forgery, paying out of pocket for private tutors and working even more overtime to ensure Jared never fell behind again. I viewed the deception as an isolated incident of youthful panic. Looking at the arrogant man sitting at my table today, I realized the devastating, undeniable truth. That high school forgery was not a mistake born of fear. It was the early manifestation of a chronic, incurable sense of entitlement. Jared had learned at a young age that manipulation yielded no consequences, only immediate rewards. He had spent his entire life refining his ability to deceive the people who loved him most. He had graduated from forging report cards to forging his dead mother's signature on a multi-million-dollar land deed. Jared looked up from his folders and greeted me with a wide, artificial smile. He did not ask about my severely bandaged hands or the intense physical pain I endured rescuing Sylvia's quilt the previous night. He simply gestured for me to sit down, adopting the condescending tone of a corporate manager addressing a redundant employee. I remained standing, refusing to yield the authority of my own home. Jared boldly announced that they were liquidating my house by the end of the month. He claimed the real estate market was peaking, and it was the perfect strategic time to maximize the asset. He casually admitted that the structural renovations on his new mansion had run millions of dollars over budget. He stated that the immediate cash sale of my home would provide the necessary capital to cover his massive financial shortfall. He spoke as if my life's work was nothing more than an emergency fund for his vanity project. Natalie chimed in, her voice dripping with a toxic, rehearsed sweetness. She told me that I should be incredibly grateful they were willing to take on the heavy burden of my geriatric care. She explained they had already arranged a dedicated space for me in their new home. They planned to convert a small damp storage room in their unfinished basement into a living quarter. She framed this exile into a windowless concrete bunker as a profoundly generous act of familial hospitality. Natalie insisted that my current neighborhood was becoming unsafe for an elderly man living alone, arguing that their subterranean basement would offer me the strict security I desperately needed. She added with a cold smirk that I could easily make myself useful by managing the mansion's daily laundry and performing basic maintenance tasks. They were not inviting me to live with them as a respected elder. They were deliberately stripping away my independence to transform me into an unpaid domestic servant trapped beneath the very floorboards of a mansion built on stolen land. Jared slid a thick, generic legal document across the wooden table accompanied by a heavy silver fountain pen. He explained it was a comprehensive power of attorney. He demanded I sign it immediately, claiming the document would allow him to handle the complex property sale on my behalf and protect me from predatory capital gains taxes. Jared's eyes were cold, calculating, and completely lacking any trace of filial respect. I stared at the document, understanding exactly what it represented. It was the final nail in my financial coffin, designed to hand him absolute legal control over every asset I possessed. I actively suppressed the burning rage expanding in my chest. I leaned forward, letting my shoulders slump heavily to project the image of a defeated, weary old man. I picked up the silver pen, wincing loudly as if my freshly burned hands were causing me agonizing pain. My fingers trembled deliberately as I gripped the barrel. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed the legal document. I utilized a deliberately flawed, legally invalid version of my signature. I purposefully dropped a vital middle initial and significantly altered the sweeping loop of my last name, rendering the authorization entirely void upon close inspection. I slid the paper back across the table. Jared snatched the document with a triumphant, greedy smirk. He was completely unaware he had just accepted a worthless piece of paper that would ultimately trigger his total ruin. The relocation occurred with humiliating speed. Within 48 hours of my house being listed on the market, movers deposited my few remaining possessions into the subterranean depths of Jared's sprawling estate. The transition was designed to strip away my dignity. The basement was entirely unfinished, a stark contrast to the gleaming marble and imported chandeliers just one floor above. The air down here was perpetually damp, smelling heavily of curing concrete and cold earth. A single exposed utility bulb cast harsh, unforgiving shadows across the cinder-block walls. My designated living quarters consisted of a narrow, windowless storage room positioned directly adjacent to the noisy industrial HVAC unit. Jared did not even bother to help me unpack. Natalie assumed complete control of my daily existence, treating me less like a father-in-law and entirely like an indentured servant. On my very first morning in the dark cellar, she descended the wooden stairs holding a laminated clipboard. She wore a pristine silk dressing gown and kept a calculated physical distance from me, as if poverty and age were highly contagious diseases. Without a single word of traditional greeting, she handed me a detailed typed list of menial daily chores. My designated tasks included polishing the expansive outdoor silver fixtures, scrubbing the stone patio on my knees, and painstakingly detailing the luxury vehicles parked in the massive garage. She spoke to me with a voice dripping in icy condescension, explicitly forbidding me from setting foot in her custom designer kitchen. She claimed my presence would disrupt her hired culinary staff and negatively impact her meticulously cultivated domestic environment. To ensure my complete isolation, she provided a cheap single-burner hot plate and a small plastic cooler, instructing me to prepare my own meager meals in the dusty corner of the utility room. She smiled cruelly, stating that I needed to earn my keep if I expected to sleep under her very expensive roof. I did not argue, nor did I raise my voice to defend my pride. I simply took the clipboard from her manicured hands and nodded my head in a display of absolute practiced docility. I allowed her to believe that she had completely broken my spirit, knowing that my quiet compliance was the greatest weapon I currently possessed. My absolute silence deeply unsettled them at first, but Jared and Natalie quickly misinterpreted my quiet endurance as profound mental defeat. They fully believed my burned hands and aging frame rendered me entirely helpless. They did not understand that a man who survives 35 years navigating the lethal molten environment of a steel mill learns to master the art of hypervigilant observation. During my decades on the factory floor, analyzing complex structural blueprints and identifying microscopic points of failure meant the critical difference between surviving a grueling shift and suffering a catastrophic, fatal accident. I seamlessly applied that exact industrial discipline to my subterranean exile. While performing Natalie's demeaning chores, I systematically evaluated the mansion's rushed construction. I noted the hollow echoes behind the expensive drywall and the settling cracks forming along the foundation lines. More importantly, I utilized my late-night isolation in the basement to meticulously map out the estate's high-tech security grid. Jared had hired a premium firm to install an elaborate web of motion sensors and high-definition cameras, but his immense arrogance made him incredibly sloppy. He never bothered to check the installation angles. I patiently documented every single blind spot in the camera coverage. I timed the precise rotational delays of the lenses and identified the unmonitored service corridors leading directly to the primary office suites. I created a flawless mental schematic of the entire property without ever arousing the slightest suspicion from the heavily armed private patrols. I knew exactly which floorboards creaked under pressure and which heavy oak doors could be bypassed without triggering the perimeter alarms. My prison had unknowingly become my tactical vantage point. Jared's fatal flaw was his absolute, unshakable belief in his own supreme intelligence, which bred a dangerous level of administrative carelessness. Because he viewed the unfinished basement solely as my degrading prison, he casually treated the expansive space immediately surrounding the massive furnace as his personal dumping ground. Dozens of heavy cardboard banker's boxes were stacked haphazardly against the concrete walls, overflowing with sensitive corporate records and unfiled financial statements he deemed too cumbersome for his pristine upstairs office. He operated under the foolish assumption that an exhausted, supposedly senile old man would never possess the mental acuity to comprehend complex investment portfolios. Every night after the mansion fell completely silent and the security patrols shifted to the exterior grounds, I emerged from my damp storage room. I utilized a small, focused pen light to meticulously sift through his discarded documents. I cross-referenced the towering stacks of paperwork with the daily refuse Natalie tossed down the stairs, salvaging torn bank statements and shredded final notices she considered unimportant trash. My healing fingers carefully smoothed out the crumpled pages in the dim, flickering light of the furnace. I spent hours reading through dense legal jargon and complicated ledger balances, painstakingly piecing together the true, horrifying state of my son's corporate empire. The facade of his immense wealth was rapidly disintegrating before my eyes. The luxury cars, the designer jewelry, and the extravagant housewarming parties were nothing more than a thin, fragile veneer masking a deep, unmanageable chasm of corporate debt. I discovered frantic correspondence from unpaid contractors and aggressive warnings from regional tax authorities. Jared was frantically juggling accounts, moving massive sums of money from one hollow shell company to another, just to maintain the absolute illusion of his high society success. Deep within the final dust-covered box hidden behind the water heater, I discovered a series of expedited loan applications that completely solidified his impending doom. Jared had recently secured $3 million in high-risk venture capital from a notoriously aggressive international lending firm. The loan contracts explicitly required massive liquid collateral. Jared had brazenly listed the 20-acre parcel of land under the mansion as his primary guarantee. To execute this massive fraud, he had repeatedly utilized my deliberately flawed forged signature alongside the original forged documents bearing Sylvia's name. He had legally pledged the assets of the blind trust to the venture capitalists, fully believing he had successfully isolated me from my own estate. He was operating under the fatal delusion that his fraudulent paperwork was airtight. He had absolutely no realization that I now held the master keys to Sylvia's impenetrable trust, or that the power of attorney he relied upon was legally void. Jared had unknowingly locked himself inside a burning financial building, and he had just handed me the only match. The $3 million deadline was rapidly approaching, and his entire empire rested on a fragile foundation of sand that I could completely wash away with a single certified legal motion. I understood that dismantling Jared's fraudulent empire required a legal predator of the highest caliber. I could not simply walk into a local law firm and write a check for a standard retainer. My preliminary investigation of the discarded bank statements confirmed my worst suspicions regarding my own finances. Jared had successfully initiated a comprehensive monitoring protocol on my retirement accounts, flagging any withdrawal over $50 for his immediate review. He was using the flawed power of attorney I had signed to systematically choke off my resources and track my movements. If I attempted to hire legal counsel through traditional financial channels, he would receive a digital alert before I even left the lawyer's lobby. He would instantly realize I was not the defeated, docile servant he believed me to be. I needed to move entirely outside the modern financial grid. I waited in the suffocating dampness of the basement until the digital clock on the utility wall flashed 2 a.m. The sprawling mansion above me settled into a heavy, uninterrupted silence. Natalie had long since dismissed the catering staff, and the synchronized footsteps of the private security patrol had shifted to the distant perimeter of the estate. I slipped my calloused feet into my heavy work boots and pulled on a dark wool coat. I bypassed the main stairwell, entirely utilizing a rusted steel bulkhead door hidden behind the massive furnace. Decades of lifting steel beams had left me with lingering arthritis, but adrenaline completely masked the pain in my joints. I pushed the heavy iron hatch upward and stepped out into the freezing night air, melting instantly into the deep shadows cast by the manicured hedges. I drove my rusted truck through the deserted city streets, parking 2 blocks away from a sleek glass skyscraper in the financial district. The glowing directory in the lobby listed the prestigious firm of Pierce and Associates on the top floor. Gregory Pierce was a man feared across the corporate landscape, renowned for his ruthless litigation tactics and his absolute refusal to settle losing cases. He charged exorbitant fees that effectively priced out anyone lacking immense corporate backing. I bypassed the main elevators and used a specialized access card Sylvia had meticulously sealed inside the waterproof pouch. The private elevator shot upward, depositing me directly into a dimly lit, mahogany-paneled executive office. Gregory sat behind a massive desk, his sharp, predatory eyes studying me as I stepped into the room. He did not ask how I bypassed his security. Instead, he stood up and respectfully offered me a leather chair. 30 years ago, Gregory was a brilliant but desperately impoverished law student on the verge of abandoning his education due to mounting debts. Sylvia, operating under the strict anonymity of a philanthropic grant she quietly administered for her real estate firm, identified his exceptional potential. She deliberately rerouted dormant charitable funds to entirely cover his tuition, living expenses, and bar exam preparations. She never asked for public recognition or repayment, demanding only that he utilize his formidable intellect to protect those who could not protect themselves against corporate tyranny. Gregory only discovered his benefactor's true identity years later through his own relentless investigation, pledging an unspoken oath of absolute loyalty to the woman who had forged his future. He looked at my bandaged hands and the soot-stained edges of my jacket, his expression hardening into cold, professional fury. I laid the massive stack of forged trust documents and the recovered venture capital loan contracts directly onto his pristine desk. Gregory adjusted his glasses and began scanning the dense legalese, his brilliant mind instantly recognizing the devastating scale of Jared's fraudulent architecture. He stated firmly that taking down a partner at a major investment firm required a financial commitment that far exceeded my frozen retirement savings. I told him I was fully prepared to compensate him for the aggressive, relentless warfare this case demanded. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together, and warned me that bringing these specific federal charges against my own flesh and blood would result in Jared facing decades in a federal penitentiary. I did not flinch or look away. I simply told Gregory that a man who burns his mother's legacy to appease strangers had already chosen his own prison. Gregory named his exorbitant retainer fee, fully expecting me to balk at the astronomical figure. I reached deep into the heavy pockets of my wool coat and pulled out 3 velvet pouches I had retrieved from Sylvia's safe deposit box. I untied the thick drawstrings and poured the contents onto the polished mahogany desk. Dozens of pristine, heavy gold coins cascaded across the wood, gleaming brilliantly in the low office light. Sylvia had quietly purchased these solid bullion reserves decades ago, systematically converting her yearly corporate bonuses into untraceable physical assets just for an emergency of this magnitude. Gregory picked up a heavy coin, expertly verifying its absolute purity and weight. He nodded slowly, sweeping the gold into his desk drawer without signing a single receipt. The transaction was completely off the books, ensuring Jared's meticulous financial monitoring would never detect the massive transfer of wealth. With his retainer secured, Gregory immediately transitioned into a legal predator. He laid out a comprehensive strategy to dismantle Jared's empire with surgical precision. He dispatched a team of silent investigators to discreetly verify the forged signatures through independent handwriting analysts. He drafted highly confidential subpoenas targeting the international venture capital firm preparing to freeze the fraudulent $3 million loan at the exact moment Jared desperately needed the capital to clear his overdrawn accounts. Gregory built a flawless, airtight trap entirely in the shadows, constructing a legal Iron Maiden around my son while leaving the illusion of total control completely undisturbed. I left the towering glass building before sunrise, returning to my damp basement cell long before Natalie's hired staff arrived to unlock the mansion's kitchen. The following afternoon, I was forcefully scrubbing the intricate stonework of the back patio under Natalie's watchful, mocking gaze. She stood safely behind the glass doors, sipping her iced tea, completely oblivious to the burner phone vibrating violently deep inside my coat pocket. I waited until she finally retreated upstairs before slipping into the dark cover of the garden shed. Gregory was on the other end of the secure line, his usually calm voice laced with urgent tension. He had run a quiet, highly invasive background check on Jared's recent corporate communications. He bypassed encrypted emails to discover a catastrophic acceleration in my son's timeline. Jared's venture capital lenders had demanded immediate physical verification of the land trust collateral by the end of the week. Facing absolute financial exposure, Jared had taken a desperate, deeply sinister measure. Gregory informed me that Jared had scheduled a private, heavily compensated medical evaluation for tomorrow morning right inside the mansion. He had hired a notoriously corrupt physician to officially evaluate my mental state and legally declare me completely incompetent. The medical declaration would grant Jared immediate emergency conservatorship, allowing him to legally bypass the forged signatures and forcefully absorb Sylvia's trust before the federal auditors arrived. The trap I was building was suddenly racing against a ticking clock. The heavy oak door of the basement swung open violently the following morning. Jared stood at the top of the stairs, demanding I wash my face and present myself in the formal sitting room immediately. I walked up the wooden steps, maintaining my slow, deliberate pace to project the physical frailty he expected to see. A tall, impeccably dressed man holding a leather medical bag waited near the grand piano. He introduced himself as Dr. Eris Thorne, a private neurological specialist. His eyes were entirely devoid of medical empathy, darting around the luxurious room as if calculating the total net worth of his surroundings. Jared and Natalie immediately flanked the doctor, forming a tight, impenetrable triangle of authority. They did not allow the physician to address me directly. Instead, Natalie began painting a tragically false narrative of my daily existence. She placed a manicured hand over her heart and claimed I had been wandering the mansion halls late at night in severe states of delusion. She lied effortlessly, stating that I frequently called out for my deceased wife and became verbally aggressive when corrected by the household staff. Jared nodded solemnly, adding that my cognitive decline had accelerated to a dangerous, unmanageable level over the past 2 weeks. He claimed I was a distinct danger to myself and completely incapable of handling basic financial decisions or personal hygiene. They actively fed the doctor a script of severe dementia, painting themselves as exhausted, loving children, forced to make an agonizing medical decision for my own safety. Dr. Thorne did not ask a single verifying question regarding their fabricated stories. He simply scribbled notes on his clipboard with a silver pen, nodding in enthusiastic agreement with every lie they produced. He treated the evaluation like a mere corporate formality rather than a critical assessment of a man's mental sovereignty. I sat quietly in a velvet armchair, observing the grotesque performance unfold. They were constructing my mental prison brick by brick, entirely confident that I was too senile to understand the terrifying implications of their words. I knew exactly how to dismantle their strategy without raising a single alarm. I spent over 2 decades serving as the lead union representative on the factory floor at the steel mill. My job required negotiating massive, highly contentious labor contracts with incredibly hostile corporate executives. I had spent countless hours sitting across polished conference tables from men exactly like Dr. Thorne. I understood how to read the subtle, greedy tells of a corrupt man seeking an easy victory. Men motivated purely by financial gain always crave absolute submission from their targets. They desperately want to believe their targets are entirely ignorant of the manipulation. I decided to give the doctor the exact false confidence he required to incriminate himself. I slumped my shoulders forward and let my jaw hang slightly slack. I stared blankly at the intricate patterns of the imported Persian rug beneath my feet. When Dr. Thorne finally turned his attention to me, I manufactured a look of profound, helpless confusion. I embodied the tragic stereotype of the grieving, broken widower completely lost in a modern world. I let my hands tremble visibly in my lap, ensuring he noticed the thick white bandages wrapping my skin. I knew my deliberate physical deterioration would validate the fraudulent narrative Jared and Natalie had so carefully constructed. The doctor smiled, a tight, predatory smile, clearly relieved that I possessed no intellectual defenses. He approached my chair with the arrogant swagger of a predator admiring completely trapped prey. Dr. Thorne knelt beside my chair and began administering a ridiculously simplistic cognitive test. He asked me to identify the current day of the week and state the full name of the sitting president. I hesitated deliberately, letting my eyes dart around the room as if searching for an invisible lifeline. I stammered heavily, slurring my words just enough to mimic severe neurological impairment. When he asked me to state the current year, I purposely gave him a date from exactly a decade ago. Natalie let out a loud theatrical sigh of manufactured sorrow, burying her face in Jared's shoulder. Jared patted her back, projecting the image of a devastated son witnessing his father's final mental collapse. Dr. Thorne patted my knee with absolute condescension and told me to rest my mind. He declared his evaluation complete. He was entirely oblivious to the tiny matte black audio recording device securely tucked deep inside my left shirt pocket. Gregory Pierce had provided the military-grade equipment during our late-night meeting. The discreet device was actively capturing every single spoken word in crystal-clear, high-definition audio. It recorded Natalie's blatant fabrications, Jared's calculated legal positioning, and the doctor's complete failure to conduct a legitimate medical examination. They were handing me the ultimate, indisputable proof of their criminal conspiracy on a silver platter. I continued to stare blankly at the wall, breathing slowly and evenly. My silence was no longer a symbol of endurance. It was an active, lethal weapon, capturing the precise sound of my family orchestrating their own spectacular destruction. The doctor stood up and walked toward the heavy oak desk near the window. He confidently pulled a stack of preliminary incapacitation forms from his leather bag. Without a single moment of professional hesitation, he signed the binding legal documents declaring me permanently unfit to manage my own affairs. I kept my head bowed, but my eyes tracked their movements through the reflection of the glass display cabinets. Jared quickly escorted the corrupt physician toward the heavy double doors leading to the main hallway. I watched through the narrow crack in the slightly ajar door as the final transaction occurred. Jared reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a remarkably thick, unmarked envelope. He handed the bulging envelope of cash directly to Dr. Thorne. The doctor slipped the bribe into his bag with practiced speed and exited the estate. Jared closed the heavy doors and turned back to face his wife. A vicious, triumphant sneer warped his features into something truly ugly. He walked over to Natalie and wrapped his arms around her waist. He whispered harshly that the nightmare was finally over. He proudly declared they would permanently transfer the old man to the crowded state psychiatric ward by Friday morning. The digital clock on the basement utility wall flashed a bright red sequence confirming it was 3 a.m. I sat on an overturned plastic crate in the damp darkness, extracting the matte black recording device from my shirt pocket. The corrupt physician's signature was practically drying on the incapacitation forms upstairs, leaving me a remarkably narrow window to halt the conservatorship filing before Jared submitted the paperwork to the family court. I plugged the discrete device into the encrypted digital drive Sylvia had left me, utilizing a secure offshore connection to completely bypass the mansion's aggressive network monitoring. The audio file transferred with agonizing slowness, displaying a bright green progress bar that illuminated the cold concrete walls. I carefully packaged the raw audio data, attaching the digital timestamp and GPS metadata to prove the exact time and location of the medical bribe. I initiated a secure digital drop directly to Gregory Pierce's private server. I watched the transmission finalize, knowing this single file possessed the power to entirely dismantle my son's fraudulent empire. I needed Gregory to strike the legal system before the courts opened, preempting Jared's attempt to legally strip away my autonomy. The basement felt significantly colder as the screen faded to black. I meticulously packed the drive back into the fireproof polymer pouch and concealed it behind a loose cinder block near the heavy iron furnace. My part of the night was complete. I lay back on my narrow, uncomfortable cot, staring up at the exposed wooden floorboards directly beneath Jared's master suite. I listened to his muffled footsteps pacing above me, blissfully unaware that a digital guillotine was currently hurtling toward his corporate throat. Gregory Pierce did not waste a single second of the early morning hours. Utilizing the undeniable audio proof of the medical bribe, he bypassed the slow local courts entirely and filed sealed emergency injunctions directly with a federal judge. By dawn, Gregory had successfully orchestrated a total immediate freeze on all of Jared's corporate accounts, citing severe elder financial abuse and imminent flight risk. I slipped into the shadows of the garden shed just after sunrise to answer the violent vibration of my burner phone. Gregory's voice was sharp, laced with absolute professional satisfaction as he confirmed the financial lock was securely in place. He then revealed the shocking results of a deep forensic dive his accountants had performed on Natalie's personal background overnight. Natalie meticulously projected the flawless image of generational wealth and elite breeding, treating everyone around her like absolute peasants. Gregory discovered that her entire pedigree was an absolute pathetic fabrication. She came from a family with a severe, highly documented history of serial bankruptcy, property foreclosures, and immense financial ruin. Her elitist attitude was nothing more than a fragile, desperate mask designed to cover a catastrophic reality. She possessed a staggering amount of unmanageable credit card debt accumulated by funding a lifestyle of private jets, designer wardrobes, and exclusive club memberships she could never legitimately afford. To prevent her aggressive creditors from destroying her carefully constructed high society image, she had been quietly and systematically siphoning funds from Jared's primary corporate operating accounts. She shifted massive sums of company money to pay her personal minimum balances, bleeding the firm dry from the inside out. Jared, blinded by his own monumental arrogance and utterly desperate to keep his trophy wife satisfied, had willfully ignored the glaring discrepancies in his own ledgers. This toxic symbiosis had entirely hollowed out their finances. They were two parasites feeding on a dying host, completely oblivious to the fact that their host was already a financial corpse. I returned to the main house to fulfill my demeaning daily chores, silently sweeping the polished marble floors of the grand hallway. Through the transparent glass walls of his private study, I watched Jared unravel completely. His financial house of cards was entirely unstable, and the federal freeze Gregory initiated had just triggered silent alarms across his entire banking network. Jared paced frantically, his face pale and slick with panicked sweat. He screamed into his mobile phone at terrified junior executives demanding rapid liquidity that simply did not exist. He was entirely reliant on a massive immediate influx of cash to satisfy his outstanding venture capital loans and prevent a comprehensive federal audit. If the auditors arrived before he could secure new capital, they would instantly discover the missing funds Natalie had embezzled and the fraudulent collateral tied to Sylvia's blind trust. Jared violently swept a stack of papers off his desk, shattering a crystal paperweight against the far wall. He was drowning in a sea of toxic debt, suffocating under the weight of his own relentless greed. I kept my head down rhythmically, moving the broom across the floor tiles. I played the role of the docile, oblivious servant to absolute perfection. I watched my son hyperventilate in his expensive suit, recognizing the frantic, uncoordinated movements of a man who suddenly realizes the ground beneath him is rapidly turning to dust. He thought he could outsmart the world, but he had simply orchestrated his own magnificent demise. The burner phone vibrated against my ribs again during my brief afternoon break in the basement. Gregory had intercepted Jared's latest panic-driven communications and uncovered the final desperate piece of the puzzle. Jared was scheduled to host a massive, highly publicized charity gala at the mansion this coming weekend. He had heavily promoted the lavish event as a philanthropic endeavor to benefit local urban development. Gregory informed me that the entire gala was an elaborate, desperate smokescreen. Jared intended to use the glittering event to secure $5 million in immediate capital from a syndicate of wealthy international investors. He planned to illegally funnel their investments directly into his failing operating accounts. He needed that exact sum to cover his massive embezzlement and satisfy the venture capitalists before the federal authorities could officially indict him. It was a spectacular, high-stakes gamble designed to save his fragile empire at the absolute last second. Gregory told me the international investors were demanding a pristine presentation before handing over the funds. The trap was fully armed, and I knew exactly where I needed to be when the jaws finally snapped shut. It was Friday morning, the critical day before the sprawling charity gala. Jared's unexpected financial freeze had driven him into a manic state, forcing him to leave the estate before dawn to personally threaten his banking executives in the city. Natalie was heavily occupied with a small army of florists and event planners transforming the main ballroom into a glittering spectacle. I needed to reach the primary international investor, a man named Arthur Sterling, before he handed Jared a $5 million lifeline. Reaching a man of Sterling's corporate magnitude was notoriously difficult. His financial fortress was guarded by layers of ruthless executive assistants trained to screen and discard unauthorized calls. Jared had heavily insulated Sterling from any outside contact, routing all communications through his own highly monitored private secretaries to ensure his fraudulent narrative remained entirely unquestioned. I could not use my hidden burner phone. Gregory had warned me that Jared's escalating panic had pushed him to deploy localized signal interceptors around the estate's perimeter to catch corporate spies. I had to use the mansion's hardwired landline in Jared's primary study, a secure line explicitly unmonitored by his own digital interceptors. I waited in the damp basement, calculating the precise rhythm of the house above me. The heavy thud of delivery crates and the shrill bark of Natalie's demands echoed relentlessly through the floorboards. When her voice drifted toward the outdoor pavilion, I climbed the wooden stairs. The massive kitchen was empty, smelling of expensive floral arrangements and heavy floor wax. I moved silently down the corridor, sliding into Jared's sprawling mahogany office and closing the heavy double doors to seal myself inside the lion's den. I approached the massive desk and picked up the polished silver receiver. I dialed the direct corporate line for Sterling's international headquarters, a highly restricted number Gregory had relayed to me the previous night. A brisk, heavily guarded voice answered immediately, demanding my credentials and the exact nature of my business. I did not attempt to explain the complex family fraud or plead for a moment of her time. I knew that dealing with elite executive gatekeepers required projecting absolute, unquestionable authority. I lowered my voice, stripping away the artificial frailty I had adopted for the corrupt doctor. I spoke with the hard, resonant cadence of a steelworker demanding immediate action. I provided my full name and instructed the assistant to interrupt Mr. Sterling's current meeting, telling her to mention a specific highly classified union strike from exactly 2 decades ago. 20 years ago, Arthur Sterling was not a celebrated international venture capitalist. He was a ruthless corporate liquidator brought in by a massive conglomerate to dismantle the regional steel mill where I served as the lead union representative. The corporation desperately wanted to gut our hard-earned pensions and strip away our negotiated healthcare benefits to maximize their quarterly liquidation margins. We locked horns in a grueling 3-week standoff across a freezing conference table. Sterling threw every dirty corporate tactic at me. He threatened aggressive legal retaliation, attempted to quietly bribe me with a highly lucrative consulting position, and tried to fracture the union's solidarity through coordinated media smears and deliberate misinformation. I never blinked. I held the line with absolute, uncompromising integrity, countering his aggressive legal maneuvers with an encyclopedic knowledge of our labor contracts and federal regulations. I refused to let him destroy the lives of the men who bled for that mill. On the final night of the bitter strike, Sterling finally folded. He authorized a comprehensive settlement that fully protected our pensions and secured our health care in perpetuity. As we signed the binding documents, he looked me directly in the eyes and admitted I was the only man he had ever faced who could not be bought or intimidated. He remembered my name. He deeply respected the immense, unyielding weight of my word. I gambled my entire strategy on the hope that Arthur Sterling still valued absolute integrity over polished corporate illusions. The secure line clicked, and the heavy, unmistakable baritone of Arthur Sterling filled the receiver. He asked if he was truly speaking to Harlan, clearly shocked to hear from the man who had nearly derailed his early corporate career. I skipped the pleasantries entirely. I immediately utilized the dense, complex financial terminology we had used during our steel negotiations, proving instantly and undeniably that my cognitive faculties were razor sharp. I told him his current $5 million investment target was functionally insolvent. I explained the precise mechanics of the fraudulent asset transfer and detailed the exact federal codes Jared was actively violating by leveraging stolen collateral. Sterling remained silent for a long, heavy moment, processing the stark reality that his massive international investment was teetering on the edge of a severe federal indictment. He asked me how I could verify these catastrophic allegations against my own flesh and blood. I told him I held the master keys to the blind trust Jared was attempting to steal, and that federal injunctions were already silently freezing my son's corporate operating accounts. I proposed a secure private meeting. I instructed Sterling to arrive at the mansion exactly 1 hour before the gala officially commenced, explicitly bypassing Jared's scheduled introductory reception. I promised to hand him the undeniable physical proof of the massive embezzlement. Sterling agreed instantly, his voice hardening into the ruthless corporate predator I remembered from 20 years ago. He stated he would arrive at 7 o'clock sharp. I placed the silver receiver back onto the cradle, but a sharp gasp fractured the silence of the study. Natalie stood in the open doorway, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She had heard enough of the conversation to realize I was actively destroying their financial lifeline. She lunged across the expensive Persian rug, her hands shaking with absolute rage. She grabbed the telephone cord and ripped it violently from the wall socket, sending the heavy base crashing onto the hardwood floor. Without a second of hesitation, she shoved me hard against the shoulder. The unexpected force sent me stumbling backward into the corridor. She screamed that I was a worthless, parasitic old man trying to ruin their lives. She pushed me aggressively down the hallway, forcing me toward the dark entrance of the basement. I stumbled down the first few wooden steps, catching myself heavily on the rusted handrail to avoid falling into the concrete depths. Natalie slammed the heavy iron door shut above me. I heard the unmistakable heavy click of the deadbolt sliding securely into place. She yelled through the thick wood, threatening to keep me locked in the freezing dark without a single drop of water or scrap of food until the gala was completely over and the investment was permanently secured. The heavy thud of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the damp basement like a gunshot. I stood at the bottom of the wooden stairs, surrounded by the cold, curing concrete, staring up at the thick oak door that separated me from the rest of the estate. Natalie had made good on her vicious threat, sealing me inside this subterranean vault, while the sprawling charity gala prepared to commence directly above my head. I could already hear the muffled, frantic movements of caterers and elite event planners rushing across the imported marble floors, setting the stage for Jared's elaborate $5 million smokescreen. Time was no longer a luxury I possessed. Arthur Sterling was scheduled to arrive in less than 3 hours for our highly classified private meeting, and Gregory Pierce was waiting nearby with the final legal ammunition required to completely dismantle my son's fraudulent empire. Remaining trapped in this windowless cellar was simply not an option. I needed to physically place the undeniable proof of Jared's massive embezzlement directly into Sterling's hands before a single investment contract was signed. I turned away from the locked door and surveyed my dimly lit surroundings. Jared and Natalie believed they had stripped me of all agency, locking an old, frail man away where he could no longer interfere with their massive corporate theft. They failed to realize that a man who spent his entire life working with his hands does not view a locked door as an insurmountable obstacle. I walked toward the chaotic pile of discarded cardboard boxes near the massive industrial HVAC unit. I needed tools, and Jared's arrogant carelessness had transformed this basement into an unorganized dumping ground of forgotten household items and leftover construction materials. I systematically shifted the heavy boxes aside, searching the dusty floor for anything I could weaponize to break my unjust confinement. Deep beneath a pile of discarded landscaping tarps, my fingers brushed against the cold, hard steel of a rusted flathead screwdriver. A careless contractor had abandoned it months ago during the mansion's rushed foundation work. I gripped the worn plastic handle, feeling a profound sense of clarity wash over me. Decades ago, during the most turbulent years of our marriage, when the violent union strikes threatened to bankrupt us entirely, Sylvia had imparted a piece of wisdom that fundamentally shaped my worldview. She always told me that silence was the loudest, most devastating weapon a person could ever wield. While arrogant men wasted their energy shouting empty threats and projecting false strength, a truly dangerous man conserved his breath and focused entirely on the mechanics of his survival. She firmly believed that panic was a luxury reserved for fools. I embraced her philosophy completely in the damp darkness of my prison. I did not waste a single ounce of energy pounding my fists against the heavy oak wood or shouting useless demands for Natalie to release me. I calmly walked back up the wooden staircase, stepping softly to avoid alerting anyone in the bustling kitchen above. I knelt on the top step, positioning myself at eye level with the heavy brass hinges securing the door to the reinforced frame. Natalie had locked the deadbolt, but the door was designed to swing inward toward the basement, exposing the hinge pins directly to my side of the threshold. I wedged the rusted tip of the screwdriver beneath the flat head of the top brass pin. I tapped the base of the handle with the heavy heel of my work boot, applying steady, calculated upward pressure. The metal groaned in quiet protest, stiff with fresh paint, but I maintained a slow, rhythmic momentum. The pin inched upward, millimeter by millimeter. I repeated the exact same meticulous process on the middle and bottom hinges, working in total, unbroken silence. I felt no fear or anxiety, only the cold mechanical precision of a laborer disassembling a flawed structure. I pulled the long brass pins free and carefully placed them in my coat pocket, successfully detaching the heavy oak door from its sturdy frame entirely from the inside without making a sound. I pressed my shoulder firmly against the unhinged side of the heavy oak door and applied a steady, forceful push. The thick wood shifted inward, completely bypassing the locked deadbolt and granting me immediate access to the brightly lit kitchen corridor. I slipped through the narrow gap, pulling the heavy door back into its original upright position to maintain the perfect illusion of a secure lock. The mansion was in a state of absolute, deafening chaos. Hired florists hurried past with towering arrangements of expensive white orchids, and the catering staff loudly debated seating charts in the main dining hall. I ignored the frantic activity and melted immediately into the deep shadows of the service hallway. My weeks of silent observation and meticulous mapping of Jared's high-tech security grid were about to pay off in full. I knew the premium motion sensors were heavily concentrated around the main entrances and the glass patio doors, designed exclusively to catch external intruders, rather than monitor the interior movement of domestic staff. I navigated the unmonitored service corridors with absolute tactical precision. I hugged the floral wallpaper tightly, stepping precisely on the structural floor joists I had previously identified to avoid triggering any betraying creaks in the expensive hardwood. When I reached the expansive back corridor leading to the side exit, I paused beneath a high-definition security camera mounted near the ceiling. I counted the exact rotational delay, anticipating its automated movement, and waiting for the lens to sweep blindly toward the far wall. I slipped swiftly beneath its field of vision, crossing the threshold and stepping out into the cool evening air. I had successfully vanished from my son's impenetrable fortress without triggering a single digital alarm, leaving his security network completely intact. I navigated the manicured hedges lining the perimeter of the estate and crossed into the shadowy alleyway situated directly behind the guest parking lot. A sleek black luxury sedan sat idling in the dark, its headlights fully extinguished. Gregory Pierce stepped out of the vehicle dressed in a sharp charcoal suit that blended seamlessly into the night. He did not ask how I had escaped the locked mansion or bypassed the armed patrols. He simply opened a leather briefcase and handed me a thick, heavy stack of certified federal documents. I ran my calloused fingers over the raised official seals. Gregory informed me that the emergency federal injunctions were fully finalized and legally binding. The massive stack of paperwork consisted of a complete nullification of Jared's forged property deed, instantly returning Sylvia's massive blind trust to my absolute control. Tucked directly beneath the financial injunctions were active signed federal arrest warrants for wire fraud, document forgery, and massive corporate embezzlement. The international investors Jared desperately courted were completely oblivious to the legal storm about to hit the gala. I secured the heavy stack of documents tightly inside my coat. The trap was now fully armed, and I was entirely ready to walk back inside and officially greet my son's wealthy guests. The sprawling mansion transformed into a glittering spectacle of manufactured opulence as the evening deepened. Valets in crisp white jackets lined the sweeping circular driveway, dutifully parking a relentless stream of imported sports cars and stretched luxury sedans. The heavy oak doors of the estate remained pinned wide open, welcoming the absolute pinnacle of the city's financial and social elite. Inside the grand ballroom, hired string quartets played classical arrangements that echoed off the imported marble flooring. Waiters navigated the dense crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with top-tier champagne and delicate culinary creations. Jared stood squarely in the center of the room, working the affluent crowd with the polished, effortless charisma of a seasoned corporate conqueror. He wore a custom midnight blue tuxedo, aggressively projecting the flawless image of a highly successful self-made billionaire. He shook hands with regional banking executives and clapped the shoulders of prominent politicians, laughing loudly at their jokes while completely masking the catastrophic financial ruin slowly suffocating him. He was a master of the corporate illusion, selling absolute confidence to men holding the very capital he desperately required to survive the impending federal audit. Natalie floated through the sea of wealthy guests with practiced grace, absorbing the envious glances of her high society peers. She paraded around the grand ballroom, radiating an aura of untouchable generational wealth. A massive, breathtaking diamond necklace rested heavily against her collarbone, catching the light of the crystal chandeliers with every calculated step she took. The brilliant stones were a physical manifestation of pure theft. She had purchased that exact piece of extravagant jewelry entirely with the retirement funds she had systematically siphoned from my monitored bank accounts over the past 6 months. She was proudly displaying the stolen financial security of a man she had literally locked in a freezing concrete cellar just hours earlier. They reveled in their stolen kingdom, completely intoxicated by the temporary validation of their wealthy peers. They operated under the fatal delusion that their subterranean prisoner was currently starving in the dark, entirely unaware that the foundation of their entire world had already been legally vaporized. I bypassed the heavily monitored front gates and navigated the darkened perimeter of the estate, utilizing the very unmonitored service corridors I had meticulously mapped during my basement exile. I slipped quietly through the side utility entrance, moving like a ghost through the labyrinth of the mansion, while the hired staff focused entirely on the demanding guests in the main ballroom. I bypassed the noisy catering prep stations and climbed the rear servant stairwell, reaching a secluded guest quarter on the second floor that Natalie had entirely neglected during her frantic gala preparations. I had strategically stashed a protective garment bag in this precise location 2 days prior, anticipating the absolute necessity of this exact moment. I stripped off my soot-stained work jacket and my heavy scuffed boots. I carefully removed a meticulously tailored black tuxedo from the protective canvas. I slid my arms into the crisp white shirt and fastened the heavy silk bow tie around my neck. This was not a rented costume designed to impress the wealthy strangers currently drinking my champagne downstairs. This was the exact suit I wore when Sylvia and I stood before our closest friends to renew our marriage vows on our 30th anniversary. It was a physical representation of enduring commitment, unshakable integrity, and the absolute power of standing by your word in a world obsessed with fleeting illusions. I adjusted the lapels in the heavy gilded mirror, watching the tired, frail old man Natalie had tried to break vanish completely. Staring back at me was the hardened, uncompromising steelworker who had once brought ruthless corporate liquidators to their knees. I patted the interior breast pocket, feeling the reassuring weight of the certified federal arrest warrants Gregory Pierce had handed me in the alleyway. I walked silently down the carpeted hallway and positioned myself in the deep, unlit shadows at the very top of the grand marble staircase. The sweeping vantage point offered a perfect, unobstructed view of the glittering ballroom below. I stood completely motionless, a silent judge, watching my own son conduct the final desperate performance of his life. Jared was holding court near the massive central fireplace, surrounded by a tight circle of the most powerful investors in the state. I immediately recognized the towering, broad-shouldered silhouette of Arthur Sterling standing directly in front of him. Jared was speaking passionately, using sweeping hand gestures to describe his aggressive expansion strategies and his unmatched ability to generate massive corporate yields. He was selling them an absolute fiction, buying their rapt attention and their professional respect using the very financial leverage he had stolen from my blind trust. He spoke of his flawless market instincts and his relentless work ethic, taking sole credit for an empire built entirely on the shattered foundation of forgery and embezzlement. He was utterly convinced he had successfully charmed Sterling into handing over the $5 million lifeline needed to save his crumbling facade. The profound tragedy of his arrogance played out right in front of my eyes. He possessed every material advantage a father could possibly provide, yet he chose to embrace the hollow, destructive path of deceit over the enduring strength of honest labor. He believed wealth dictated a man's ultimate value, completely failing to realize that true power stems from possessing the absolute truth. I watched him raise his glass to the wealthy crowd, thoroughly enjoying his stolen spotlight before the inevitable fall. Jared stepped toward the center of the room and tapped his silver spoon against the rim of his crystal champagne flute. The sharp, clear ringing sound instantly cut through the low hum of affluent conversation. The string quartet ceased playing, and the hundreds of guests turned their complete attention toward my son. Jared beamed under the intense spotlight, puffing out his chest to project supreme authority. He began a grandiose, heavily rehearsed speech detailing his meteoric rise to the very top of the financial sector. He spoke with immense, unearned pride about building his sprawling empire from absolutely nothing. He explicitly and forcefully claimed he had achieved his massive success entirely through his own unmatched brilliance, aggressively stating that he had received absolutely zero financial help or strategic guidance from his family. The sheer audacity of his lie echoed perfectly off the vaulted ceilings. He raised his glass high, preparing to propose a toast to his own self-made legacy. I gripped the polished mahogany handrail of the grand staircase. I stepped out of the concealing shadows and walked slowly down the marble steps directly into the blinding chandelier light. I descended the final marble step, the heavy fabric of my tailored tuxedo absorbing the brilliant light of the crystal chandeliers overhead. The rhythmic clinking of champagne glasses and the low murmur of affluent conversations abruptly ceased, replaced by a sweeping wave of hushed, confused whispers. The city's financial elite parted instinctively, forming a wide, silent path as I walked with deliberate, measured strides directly into the exact center of the grand ballroom. I did not look like the frail, defeated prisoner they had been told about. I stood tall, my shoulders squared with the enduring strength forged by decades of crushing industrial labor. The physical transformation was immediate and undeniably powerful. Natalie was standing near the towering floral arrangements, her manicured hand gripping a champagne flute so tightly her knuckles turned bone white. The vibrant color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost trapped inside a designer gown. She stared at me in absolute horrified disbelief, her mind desperately trying to comprehend how the broken old man she had personally locked in a freezing concrete cellar was now dominating her meticulously curated high society gala. Jared was caught entirely off guard, his crystal glass suspended halfway to his mouth. The arrogant self-made billionaire facade he had spent the entire evening projecting shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single coherent sound. The supreme unearned confidence that defined his entire existence evaporated instantly in the presence of undeniable truth. He took a hesitant, clumsy step backward, bumping awkwardly against the edge of the grand fireplace. He stammered pathetically, trying to articulate a command, but absolute panic had completely paralyzed his vocal cords. He was a fraud stripped bare in front of his most crucial audience. Natalie's survival instinct violently overrode her initial shock. She frantically locked eyes with the lead private security contractor stationed near the catering double doors. She aggressively gestured toward me, her face contorting with panic. She loudly demanded the immediate removal of the confused, trespassing old man who had supposedly wandered up from the service quarters. Two heavily armed private security guards immediately stepped forward, their hands resting on their tactical belts as they moved swiftly to physically restrain me and drag me out of the glittering ballroom. I did not flinch or take a single step backward. I maintained my ground, projecting the exact same unyielding stillness I had utilized 30 years ago when facing down hostile corporate strikebreakers on the factory floor. Before the imposing guards could close the final distance, a towering, broad-shouldered figure separated himself from the cluster of wealthy international investors. Arthur Sterling stepped directly into the center of the tension, raising a massive hand with absolute, unquestionable authority. His deep, commanding baritone voice echoed across the silent marble floor, explicitly ordering the security personnel to stand down immediately. The guards froze in their tracks, recognizing the immense power of the man issuing the command. Sterling turned his steely gaze toward Natalie, his expression radiating absolute professional disgust. He announced to the entire bewildered room that I was not a confused wanderer, but rather his personal, highly respected, and specifically invited guest. The sudden revelation hit Jared like a physical blow. Sterling slowly walked toward me, extending his hand in a gesture of profound mutual respect. He firmly grasped my hand explicitly, acknowledging the uncompromising integrity I had demonstrated 2 decades prior during the most brutal labor negotiation of his corporate career. He stated loudly that he knew exactly who I was, praising me as a man whose word carried more weight than any printed contract or fabricated financial ledger. The deliberate reference to our shared history instantly validated my presence and entirely destroyed Natalie's desperate attempt to paint me as a delusional invalid. Sterling's public endorsement was an impenetrable shield. By aligning his immense corporate weight directly with my silent authority, he effectively neutralized Jared and Natalie's ability to control the narrative. They were completely paralyzed, forced to watch helplessly as their primary financial lifeline openly aligned himself with the man they had spent months systematically trying to destroy. The collective realization swept through the crowded ballroom with the devastating force of a sudden winter freeze. The gathered elite of the city were ruthless, calculating predators who survived by instinctively recognizing the flow of true power. They immediately understood the monumental significance of Arthur Sterling's intervention. Sterling was the undisputed kingmaker in their financial circles, a man whose mere presence could validate a burgeoning empire or instantly crush a failing corporate enterprise. By explicitly shielding me from Jared's aggressive security forces, Sterling had publicly signaled a catastrophic shift in the room's entire hierarchy. The hushed, confused whispers completely died away. The grand ballroom fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The air grew thick with palpable tension as hundreds of wealthy guests collectively held their breath, their eyes darting rapidly between Jared's pale, sweating face and my calm, unwavering stance. The carefully constructed illusion of Jared's high society dominance evaporated, leaving him entirely exposed and incredibly vulnerable. The ambitious guests who had eagerly toasted his success just moments earlier now instinctively distanced themselves from him, physically stepping back to avoid being associated with a man actively falling from grace. The sudden expanding void around the central fireplace isolated Jared entirely. He was drowning in a sea of silent, judgmental stares from the very people he had desperately sought to impress. The opulent surroundings, the imported flowers, and the glittering crystal chandeliers no longer served as symbols of his immense success. They had transformed into the gilded bars of a trap he had unknowingly built for himself. The crowd simply waited, possessing the collective predatory patience of vultures circling a severely wounded animal. They knew a financial execution was imminent, and they were utterly captivated by the silent, undeniable power radiating from the center of the room. I did not need to raise my voice to command absolute attention. The heavy silence of the ballroom amplified my words perfectly. I looked directly into Jared's terrified eyes, stripping away the final remnants of his corporate facade. I stated calmly and clearly that building an empire on stolen land was the fastest, most guaranteed way to orchestrate a total collapse. I told him that a foundation forged in deception and elder abuse could never support the immense weight of his arrogant ambition. Jared flinched as if I had physically struck him, his breath hitching painfully in his chest. He fully realized that his meticulously planned embezzlement was entirely exposed to the exact audience he needed to deceive. I reached inside the tailored jacket of my black tuxedo and retrieved the thick, certified legal envelope Gregory Pierce had handed me in the shadowy alleyway. I did not hand the devastating documents to my son. I turned and placed the heavy envelope directly into Arthur Sterling's outstretched hand. The federal arrest warrants and the complete nullification of Jared's fraudulent property deed rested safely with the international investor. The lethal trap was now fully armed, and the explosive detonation was absolutely inevitable. Arthur Sterling accepted the heavy manila envelope with the steady, unhurried grace of a man entirely accustomed to holding the fate of empires in his hands. He did not look at Jared. His piercing gaze remained fixed on the thick stack of paper as he broke the federal seal. The sharp tear of the heavy paper echoed like a cracking whip through the absolute silence of the grand ballroom. Every single guest remained completely frozen, instinctively understanding that the carefully orchestrated illusion of wealth surrounding them was about to be violently dismantled. Sterling pulled the certified documents into the light of the crystal chandeliers. He adjusted his stance and began to read aloud, his deep, resonant voice projecting the undeniable truth to the furthest corners of the opulent room. He started with the emergency federal injunctions, clearly articulating the immediate and total freeze of Jared's primary corporate operating accounts. He read the exact legal statutes citing severe financial misconduct and imminent flight risk. The polished elite investors standing in the inner circle exchanged sharp, calculating glances. The low murmur of polite high society conversation instantly morphed into a harsh, buzzing hive of rising anger and genuine alarm. These were men and women who had just been aggressively solicited for millions of dollars, and they were now listening to a federal mandate declaring their prospective business partner a functional criminal. Sterling's voice never wavered as he moved to the second document. He read the federal arrest warrants explicitly detailing charges of wire fraud and massive corporate embezzlement. The color completely drained from the faces of the venture capitalists who had already extended massive lines of credit to Jared's failing firm. They instantly recognized that their multi-million-dollar investments were not tied to a booming tech enterprise, but were rather sinking rapidly into a bottomless pit of toxic debt. The glittering ballroom, previously a monument to Jared's supreme arrogance, transformed into a tribunal of his furious peers. Jared frantically attempted to interrupt, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of appeasement, but the sheer volume of the angry murmurs drowned him out completely. He was watching his entire world burn to ash in real time, completely powerless to extinguish the flames. Sterling held the documents high, letting the official federal seals catch the light, forcing every investor in the room to witness the absolute reality of Jared's magnificent ruin. Sterling flipped to the next section of the comprehensive legal dossier, his expression hardening into a mask of pure disgust. He loudly detailed the forensic accounting report exposing the forged property deed. He explained precisely how Jared had illegally leveraged Sylvia's irrevocable blind trust, a sacred financial safeguard established decades ago to protect our family's core assets from corporate volatility. Sterling then read the meticulous ledger documenting the stolen retirement funds. He explicitly outlined how those specific protected accounts had been systematically drained to purchase the very diamonds currently resting on Natalie's neck. The crowd collectively stepped away from her as if she were carrying a highly infectious disease, their eyes locked onto the stolen jewelry with absolute revulsion. The final document Sterling produced was the certified transcript of the digital audio recording. He read the exact, undeniable words Jared had used to bribe the corrupt physician into falsely declaring me mentally unfit. The stark brutality of a son actively purchasing his own father's medical incarceration echoed through the horrified crowd. Jared snapped. The terrifying reality of his total exposure shattered his remaining composure. He lunged forward, his face slick with panic and sweat waving his arms erratically. He screamed at the top of his lungs, desperately commanding the investors to stop listening. He shouted that the documents were elaborate forgeries created by a deeply sick, delusional man. He aggressively pointed his trembling finger at me wildly, claiming that I was suffering from severe advanced dementia. He pleaded with the room, his voice cracking with hysteria, insisting that my mind was entirely broken and that the entire spectacle was the tragic result of severe cognitive decay. He banked his entire survival on the desperate hope that the crowd would rather believe a wealthy young CEO than a frail old man. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic shouting. I allowed his desperate lies to hang in the tense air for a long, revealing moment. I slowly reached into the interior pocket of my tailored black tuxedo and withdrew a single crisp envelope. I stepped forward and handed it directly to Sterling. I instructed him to read the final page. Sterling unfolded the heavy paper, his eyes quickly scanning the official state letterhead. He raised his voice once again, cutting through Jared's hysterical protests. He announced that he was holding a comprehensive, completely flawless cognitive evaluation. He read the date aloud, proving the examination had been conducted a mere 48 hours prior. I had not relied on a single easily manipulated local doctor. I had traveled directly to the state capitol and submitted myself to a rigorous 4-hour psychological assessment administered by an independent state-appointed medical board. They had subjected me to a battery of intense neurological stress tests and complex reasoning evaluations. The final legally binding conclusion stated unequivocally that my mental faculties were not only perfectly intact, but operated with exceptional precise clarity. I possessed the undeniable mental acuity of a man half my age. Sterling held the state-certified medical seal up for the entire room to witness. The irrefutable proof instantly validated the audio transcript of the medical bribe. Jared's desperate defense evaporated into the cold air. The medical board's pristine evaluation rendered the corrupt physician's fraudulent paperwork entirely worthless, legally proving that Jared had actively engaged in a criminal conspiracy to falsely imprison me for financial gain. The assembled crowd grasped the absolute terrifying depth of my son's moral bankruptcy. The grand ballroom fell dead silent, the absolute quiet of a space where immense power had just violently and permanently shifted. The silence shattered into a chaotic uproar of furious demands. The international investors swarmed Jared, their polite high society facades completely abandoned. They aggressively shouted for the immediate return of their capital, physically cornering him against the marble fireplace. They recognized they were dealing with a massive liability and scrambled ruthlessly to salvage their exposed assets. Arthur Sterling did not join the frantic mob. He calmly pulled his secure mobile phone from his jacket pocket and initiated a direct call to his senior litigation team. He stared coldly at Jared while issuing rapid, precise instructions to draft a massive, comprehensive fraud lawsuit against Jared's entire corporate entity. He ordered his attorneys to freeze every remaining physical asset and prepare for immediate asset liquidation. Jared sank against the cold marble, burying his face in his trembling hands as his entire empire violently collapsed around him in real time. The string quartet had long since packed away their instruments, leaving only the harsh, echoing sounds of financial ruin. Suddenly, a deafening, authoritative pounding resonated from the mansion's massive oak front doors. The heavy rhythmic striking carried the unmistakable, urgent force of federal law enforcement arriving to execute their warrants. The heavy oak doors at the entrance of the grand ballroom did not merely open, they were violently breached. The deafening crash of the doors slamming against the marble walls silenced the remaining chaotic murmurs of the panicked investors. A synchronized column of uniformed federal agents, flanked closely by heavily armed local police officers, marched decisively into the opulent space. Their dark tactical windbreakers stood in stark, jarring contrast to the glittering crystal chandeliers and the vibrant designer gowns of the assembled elite. They moved with absolute terrifying purpose, completely ignoring the elaborate floral arrangements and the scattered trays of spilled champagne. The city's most powerful socialites, men and women, who typically believed themselves entirely above the reach of standard law enforcement, instinctively fell silent. They parted like the Red Sea, rapidly pressing their bodies against the silk-lined walls to create a wide, unobstructed path for the advancing authorities. The sheer visual impact of federal tactical gear invading an exclusive black-tie gala instantly paralyzed the room. No one dared to speak protest or intervene. The wealthy investors who had just been relentlessly demanding their money back from Jared instantly faded into the periphery, desperate to avoid catching the attention of the advancing agents. They understood perfectly that standing too close to a sinking corporate ship during a federal raid was financial suicide. The rhythmic, heavy thud of tactical boots against the imported marble flooring echoed like a slow, deliberate drumbeat of impending justice. The lead agent, a tall woman with steel gray hair and an unwavering gaze, stopped exactly 10 feet from the massive fireplace. She locked her eyes directly onto my son, trapping him in a glare that offered zero room for negotiation or escape. The absolute reality of his magnificent ruin had finally arrived in full uniform. The moment the lead federal agent stepped forward, Natalie's survival instincts violently overrode her marital vows. She had spent the last 7 years meticulously constructing an impenetrable image of absolute devotion to Jared, presenting themselves to the high society media as the ultimate unified corporate power couple. During their lavish wedding, which I had paid for entirely out of my own pocket, she had publicly sworn to stand by his side through any adversity. Now faced with the undeniable reality of federal prison, that carefully rehearsed devotion evaporated instantly. She physically recoiled from Jared as if he were suddenly engulfed in flames. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the hem of her expensive designer gown, and raised her hands in a frantic gesture of surrender. She did not lower her voice or attempt any discretion. Natalie screamed across the silent ballroom, hysterically declaring that she had absolutely no knowledge of Jared's financial operations. She loudly announced to the federal agents and the stunned crowd of investors that she was merely a traditional housewife, completely isolated from the mechanics of his corporate empire. She aggressively pointed her finger directly at her husband's chest, throwing him to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. She claimed he handled all the banking, all the property deeds, and all the international investments. She painted herself as an innocent, manipulated victim, desperately trying to sever her sinking reputation from his catastrophic legal collapse. Her absolute loyalty had never belonged to Jared. It had only ever belonged to the wealth he provided. I watched her frantic betrayal with a cold, hollow recognition. Years ago, Sylvia had warned me that Natalie's affection possessed the depth of a shallow puddle driven entirely by predatory ambition rather than genuine human connection. Sylvia had noticed how Natalie only smiled when discussing property acquisitions and completely tuned out during conversations about family health or emotional well-being. My wife's quiet, observant intuition was proving devastatingly accurate right in front of my eyes. Natalie was entirely willing to watch the man she married be dragged away in chains, provided she could somehow salvage her own access to his remaining accounts. She threw her husband into the fire, entirely unaware that the flames of absolute justice were already licking at her own heels and threatening to consume her entire existence. The lead federal agent completely ignored Natalie's hysterical, echoing pleas. She maintained her focus exclusively on Jared, who remained slumped against the cold marble of the grand fireplace, completely immobilized by shock. The agent unclipped a thick stack of folded documents from her tactical belt and stepped into the center of the clearing. She did not bother to lower her voice, projecting her words with absolute clarity across the cavernous ballroom. She formally announced the execution of multiple federal arrest warrants targeting Jared for a staggering array of severe corporate crimes. She listed the charges sequentially, each offense landing like a physical blow against his shattered reputation. She loudly cited multiple counts of grand larceny, massive systemic wire fraud, and the deliberate malicious financial exploitation of a vulnerable senior citizen. The explicit mention of elder financial abuse sent a fresh wave of disgusted murmurs rippling through the surrounding crowd of elite investors. Jared did not attempt to argue or deploy his usual arrogant charm. The polished, untouchable corporate titan had been completely hollowed out, leaving only a terrified, trembling man facing the catastrophic consequences of his own boundless greed. He slowly raised his hands, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. Two heavily armored officers stepped forward immediately, grabbing his wrists with practiced, unapologetic force. They pulled his arms sharply behind his back. The harsh, metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around Jared's wrists echoed sharply throughout the silent room. The symbol of his total defeat was undeniable. The officers roughly turned him around, officially placing him in federal custody right in the middle of his own magnificent, fraudulent charity gala. The spectacular empire he had built on a foundation of absolute lies had finally collapsed into a pile of inescapable rubble. Natalie let out a loud, shuddering sigh of relief as the officers began marching Jared toward the ballroom exit. She visibly adjusted the heavy, stolen diamond necklace resting against her collarbone, foolishly believing her desperate public betrayal had successfully secured her own salvation. Her relief was completely shattered an instant later. The lead federal agent turned sharply on her heel and locked eyes directly with Natalie. The agent pulled a second separate folded document from her jacket. She stepped directly into Natalie's personal space and announced the execution of an active federal warrant for massive systemic credit card fraud and criminal conspiracy. The agent explicitly detailed the unauthorized siphoning of my protected retirement funds. Before Natalie could utter a single syllable of defense, a female officer grabbed her wrists and slammed heavy steel handcuffs over her manicured hands. The cold metal trapped her completely. Natalie lost her mind entirely. She began to thrash violently against the officer's grips, screaming hysterically at the top of her lungs. As they dragged her forcefully across the marble floor toward the exit, her voice tore through the grand ballroom, frantically and aggressively screeching that the sprawling mansion and everything inside it rightfully belonged to her forever. The heavy oak doors remained pinned open, framing the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers parked haphazardly across the manicured driveway. Natalie's hysterical screams echoed against the vaulted ceilings, her voice cracking as she desperately demanded the officers release her, violently asserting that she was the absolute queen of the estate. The federal agents ignored her frantic thrashing, their grips unyielding as they hauled her toward the grand foyer. From the ranks of the tactical officers, Gregory Pierce stepped smoothly into the center of the shattered ballroom. He wore his charcoal suit like a suit of armor, projecting an aura of absolute legal supremacy that instantly commanded the attention of every remaining guest. He did not raise his voice to compete with Natalie's screeching. He simply raised a single hand, signaling for a moment of absolute quiet. The room obeyed instantly. Gregory looked directly at Jared, who was now slumped between two armed officers, his tailored midnight blue tuxedo looking suddenly absurd and pathetic. Gregory addressed the captive couple with clinical precision. He announced to the assembled crowd of terrified investors and silent socialites that the magnificent estate surrounding them was never the property of Jared or his wife. He explicitly detailed how Jared had constructed a massive web of deceit, utilizing fabricated deeds and highly illegal corporate leverage to project an illusion of absolute ownership. Gregory systematically dismantled Jared's entire false narrative in front of the very people the boy had spent millions of stolen dollars trying to impress. He informed the elite crowd that every piece of expensive art, every imported marble tile, and the very ground beneath their feet represented the largest single piece of evidence in an active federal fraud investigation. The wealthy guests exchanged horrified glances, realizing that attending this opulent gala had inadvertently made them witnesses to a historic financial collapse. Natalie stopped struggling for a fraction of a second, her tear-streaked face contorting in pure disbelief. She looked wildly at Jared, demanding he silence the lawyer and fix the catastrophic situation. Jared simply lowered his head, completely broken under the crushing weight of public exposure. Gregory buttoned his suit jacket, signaling the absolute end of Jared's corporate reign. I stood perfectly still near the grand staircase, watching the legal execution of my son's empire unfold with absolute precision. Looking at Gregory's calm, commanding presence, a profound realization washed over me. This entire sequence of events was not a sudden stroke of luck or a hastily assembled defense. This was Sylvia's final, magnificent masterstroke. Decades ago, while I was exhausted from fighting grueling union battles, Sylvia had quietly and meticulously observed the dark, predatory ambition taking root in our son. She saw how Jared manipulated his classmates, how he lied easily to teachers, and how he valued material wealth over fundamental human decency. She knew with absolute certainty that his relentless greed would eventually consume him entirely. While I foolishly hoped my son would outgrow his toxic selfishness, Sylvia silently constructed an impenetrable fortress of legal protections. She spent years secretly consulting with Gregory, establishing the irrevocable blind trust and structuring the property deeds to automatically revert to my absolute control the moment Jared attempted any unauthorized corporate leverage. She deliberately allowed Jared to believe he held the reins of power, giving him enough rope to hang himself while permanently shielding me from his inevitable financial suicide. Sylvia always told me that silence was the loudest weapon a person could wield. She had weaponized her silence perfectly, transforming her quiet observations into a flawless legal trap designed specifically to neutralize her own son's corruption. She protected the man she loved from beyond the grave, proving that her quiet intellect was vastly superior to Jared's loud, arrogant ambition. Gregory reached into his leather briefcase and produced a thick, heavy stack of documents bound with a thick red seal. He held the paperwork aloft, addressing both the captive couple and the remaining federal agents. He formally announced that the entire estate, including the sprawling mansion, the surrounding acreage, and all associated physical assets, belonged solely and exclusively to the Sylvia Memorial Trust. He stated clearly that I, Harlan, was the sole executor and exclusive beneficiary of that trust. The declaration struck Natalie with the force of a physical blow. The absolute reality crashed down upon her. The magnificent ballroom where she had humiliated me, the luxurious master suite she had aggressively claimed, and the very walls she had used to imprison me in the basement were legally and undeniably my property. Gregory methodically read the specific legal clauses explicitly stating that any modifications, transfers, or sales initiated by Jared were functionally void and criminally fraudulent. Jared had actively tried to sell a fortress he never owned to international investors who were now watching him be hauled away in federal chains. Arthur Sterling stood near the fireplace, his arms crossed over his broad chest, nodding in grim satisfaction as Gregory systematically destroyed the last remaining fragment of Jared's false empire. The absolute power dynamic of the estate was officially and permanently inverted. I was no longer the discarded, abused old man swept into the shadows. I was the absolute master of the domain. Gregory stepped directly in front of Jared and Natalie, his voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving register. He informed them that their personal accounts, offshore holdings, and corporate assets were completely and permanently frozen by federal mandate. They possessed absolutely nothing. Gregory then looked at the lead tactical officer and formally declared that the two individuals in handcuffs were officially trespassing on my private property. The officer nodded sharply, gripping Jared by the bicep and pushing him firmly toward the exit. The police dragged the disgraced couple through the massive front doors. Natalie screamed hysterically into the cool night air, wildly thrashing against the officers as she demanded access to her stolen diamonds. Her voice cracked, echoing pitifully across the expansive lawn as they shoved her into the back of a waiting squad car. Jared offered zero resistance, stepping into the caged vehicle with the hollow, dead eyes of a man who realized his life was permanently over. Their grand, glittering gala had spectacularly transformed into a brutal, highly public exhibition of their absolute ruin. The flashing police lights illuminated the mansion, signaling the definitive end of their corrupt reign. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal cruisers finally disappeared down the long, winding driveway, swallowed entirely by the deep darkness of the estate's sprawling tree line. Inside the grand ballroom, the chaotic, frantic energy of the tactical raid evaporated instantly, replaced by an urgent, deeply embarrassed silence. The remaining members of the city's financial elite did not linger to offer their sympathies or ask probing questions. They moved with a synchronized, desperate haste toward the coat checks and valet stations, their polished dignity completely abandoned. Men who had spent the entire evening boasting loudly about their market conquests now kept their eyes glued to the imported marble floor, terrified that making eye contact might somehow legally implicate them in Jared's catastrophic downfall. Women gathered their expensive silk wraps and hurried out the massive oak doors, their prior admiration for the estate replaced by a visible, shuddering revulsion. It was a spectacular, unceremonious exodus of fair-weather friends fleeing a rapidly sinking ship. Within 20 minutes, the sprawling mansion was entirely empty of its glittering audience. The federal agents and local police officers methodically processed the remaining physical evidence in the main study, meticulously cataloging Jared's abandoned corporate laptops and the counterfeit financial ledgers. Gregory Pierce stood quietly near the cold fireplace, ensuring the authorities possessed every single necessary document to secure the federal indictments. Once the final evidence bags were sealed, the lead tactical agent offered me a brief, respectful nod before leading her team out the front entrance. The heavy doors closed behind them with a definitive, echoing thud. The sudden quiet was absolute and almost deafening. The catering staff had vanished through the service exits long ago, leaving behind half-empty crystal champagne flutes and untouched hors d'oeuvres scattered across the linen-draped tables. I stood completely alone in the center of the massive room, surrounded by the physical remnants of my son's shattered illusions. I slowly walked through the lavishly decorated spaces of my reclaimed home, my footsteps completely muffled by the thick Persian rugs. The silence was no longer a weapon used against me by my arrogant son. It was a profound, comforting blanket wrapping securely around the massive estate. I moved from the grand ballroom into the formal dining hall, inspecting the absurd floral arrangements and the rented crystal centerpieces that Natalie had obsessively curated to project an image of generational wealth. Every opulent detail felt entirely hollow, a desperate, transparent mask designed to cover the rot eating away at their moral core. I continued down the main corridor toward the grand foyer, intending to secure the primary locks for the night and seal the house from the outside world. As I approached the heavy front doors, my eyes caught sight of 3 massive matching designer suitcases hastily shoved into the shadowed alcove beneath the curving staircase. I recognized Natalie's signature luggage immediately. In the frantic, screaming minutes before the federal agents physically dragged her out to the waiting squad cars, she must have desperately attempted to secure a highly lucrative golden parachute. I approached the abandoned luggage, feeling a cold, sharp wave of suspicion wash over me. The largest suitcase was unzipped slightly, a glaring sign of a rushed, panicked packing job. I knelt on the polished hardwood floor and pulled the heavy brass zipper across the track, throwing the stiff leather lid open. Beneath a chaotic, tangled pile of expensive silk blouses and heavy cashmere sweaters, a familiar dark velvet box rested heavily at the very bottom of the case. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I recognized the deep burgundy fabric instantly. I reached past the designer clothing and pulled the box out into the bright light of the foyer chandelier. I unclasped the small golden latch and lifted the lid. Resting perfectly on the white satin lining was Sylvia's entire collection of antique jewelry. Natalie had not merely attempted to flee with her own fraudulently purchased designer wardrobes to save her own skin. She had actively used the screaming chaos of the federal raid to loot my deceased wife's most sacred personal possessions. The heavy diamond brooches, the solid gold lockets, and the delicate platinum rings were all gathered here in a final despicable act of pure, unadulterated greed. Natalie had fully intended to pawn the physical memories of the woman who had built this family sanctuary, demonstrating a level of moral bankruptcy that defied all logical comprehension. My calloused fingers gently brushed against the stunning centerpiece of the collection, a perfectly matched strand of iridescent Akoya pearls. The smooth, cool surface of the delicate gems instantly transported me back 4 decades in time. We were living in a cramped, drafty 2-bedroom apartment near the grimy industrial district, struggling to keep the lights on while the regional steel mill faced continuous, devastating layoffs. Sylvia never once complained about the crushing financial weight we carried together. She managed our meager household budget with absolute quiet grace, wearing frayed coats and meticulously mending my worn work shirts so we could afford decent meals for a young Jared. I desperately wanted to give her something beautiful, something permanent that proved my enduring devotion and eternal gratitude. I volunteered for every single available overtime shift in the blistering heat of the blast furnace, working grueling double rotations for 6 straight months. My hands blistered constantly and my back ached relentlessly, but I saved every extra dollar in a rusted coffee can hidden safely beneath our bedroom floorboards. When I finally presented her with the burgundy velvet box on our 10th wedding anniversary, She wept with a quiet, overwhelming joy that completely erased the deep exhaustion from my bones. Those pearls were not a symbol of casual, unearned wealth. They were the physical manifestation of my blood, my sweat, and my absolute dedication to the woman who grounded my entire soul. I lifted the pearls from the stolen suitcase with profound, quiet reverence, refusing to let them remain tainted by Natalie's venomous touch for another second. I gathered the entire velvet box and walked deliberately toward my private study at the back of the house. I approached the heavy steel wall safe hidden behind the oak bookshelves, quickly entering the numerical combination Sylvia and I had chosen together so many years ago. The heavy steel door clicked open smoothly. I placed the jewelry box securely inside the reinforced vault, locking away the last tangible pieces of her beautiful legacy, where Jared and his wife could never reach them again. The sharp, piercing ring of the study's landline shattered the quiet sanctity of the room. The sudden jarring noise echoed harshly against the dark mahogany walls, disrupting the absolute peace I had just secured. I stared at the polished silver receiver resting on the heavy wooden desk, watching the digital caller identification screen flash with a bright, relentless blue light. The display clearly identified the incoming call as originating directly from the high-security processing center at the county jail. The federal agents had officially completed their transport and booking procedures. I stepped forward and picked up the heavy receiver, pressing it slowly to my ear without speaking a single greeting. Jared's voice immediately flooded the phone line. The arrogant, untouchable billionaire persona was completely eradicated. In his place was a terrified, hyperventilating child facing the absolute destruction of his reality. He was sobbing uncontrollably, his voice cracking with pure terror as he desperately begged me to contact Gregory Pierce immediately. He pleaded with me to authorize a massive wire transfer from the Sylvia Memorial Trust to post his federal bail. He cried frantically, swearing blindly that he would change his ways, that he was incredibly sorry for everything, and that he absolutely could not survive a single night locked inside a concrete cell. He was openly weeping, desperately begging the exact same man he had ruthlessly locked in a freezing basement just hours earlier to become his ultimate financial savior. Jared's voice poured through the heavy silver receiver, stripped entirely of the polished, untouchable corporate arrogance he had projected just hours earlier. In its place was a frantic, hyperventilating desperation. He weaponized his vulnerability with the practiced ease of a man who had spent decades manipulating every emotional bond he possessed. He sobbed loudly, demanding I remember that he was my flesh and blood, desperately trying to construct a lifeline out of the very biological connection he had spent the last 5 years treating with absolute contempt. He frantically played the role of the terrified, repentant child begging his father to rescue him from the cold, concrete reality of a federal holding cell. He swore wildly that the entire financial disaster was a catastrophic misunderstanding, a minor corporate oversight that had spiraled completely out of his control due to aggressive accountants and bad legal advice. When he realized those pathetic business excuses were failing to elicit a sympathetic response, he immediately pivoted to weaponizing our shared history. He invoked his childhood, desperately reminding me of the weekends I spent teaching him to ride his bicycle, leaning heavily into the narrative that he was my only son. He insisted that true family must endure absolutely every hardship together, that blood bound us to forgive even the most horrific transgressions regardless of the damage inflicted. He swore a frantic, tear-soaked oath to change his entire life. He promised to dissolve his failing company, to divorce Natalie immediately, without contesting a single asset, to attend any intense psychological rehabilitation program I demanded, and to spend the rest of his natural life making amends for his blinding greed. He banked everything on the fundamental assumption that a father's unconditional love could easily be twisted into an impenetrable shield against federal justice. I stood perfectly still in the quiet study, gripping the receiver, listening to the hollow echo of his desperate bargains. He believed he could simply purchase his freedom with empty promises of sudden moral reform, completely failing to understand that the currency of my trust had been entirely depleted. His pleas were not born of genuine remorse or a sudden awakening of his corrupted conscience. They were born exclusively from the terrifying realization that his actions finally carried inescapable physical consequences. I allowed his desperate bargaining to echo in the dark mahogany room for a long minute before I finally spoke. I did not raise my voice or match his frantic pleading energy. I told him calmly that his entire empire of deceit had been built on a foundation I had deliberately rigged to collapse from the very beginning. I revealed the complete truth about the master power of attorney he had so casually slid across my desk 10 months ago. He had disguised that predatory legal document as routine corporate maintenance, hoping my failing eyesight and assumed cognitive decay would blind me to his ultimate devastating theft. I informed him that my mind was perfectly sharp that afternoon. I recognized the comprehensive transfer of our core assets immediately. I did not confront him, shout at him, or tear the fraudulent document to pieces. Instead, I deliberately signed the binding paperwork using an incorrect middle initial and an intentionally flawed variation of my legal signature. I handed him back an utterly worthless piece of paper, smiling quietly as he tucked his own destruction into his expensive leather briefcase. I told Jared that I knew his boundless greed could never be reasoned with or negotiated away. If I had stopped his scheme that afternoon, he would simply have retreated, regrouped, and engineered a darker, more insidious method to steal his mother's legacy. By handing him that flawed document, I actively gave him the shovel to dig his own financial grave deep enough that he could never possibly climb out. I allowed him to build his massive, fraudulent corporate leverage upon a legal bedrock that would automatically disintegrate the moment it was subjected to federal scrutiny. He had marched himself happily into an inescapable trap of his own making, blinded entirely by his own supreme arrogance. Jared gasped over the phone line, the horrifying realization of my quiet, devastating sabotage completely paralyzing his vocal cords. He stammered frantically, struggling to formulate a coherent excuse for his original betrayal. He whined pathetically that his tech company had been failing miserably behind the scenes, that he was utterly desperate to maintain his high society status among his ruthless peers, and that he had fully intended to repay the stolen trust funds the absolute moment his international investments matured. I listened patiently, holding the receiver with a steady hand until his pathetic, rambling justifications completely exhausted themselves and dissolved into heavy, defeated breathing. When absolute silence finally fell over the line, I spoke with a glacial, unforgiving calm that offered zero comfort. I informed him that his working definition of kinship was a toxic, one-sided transaction designed solely to facilitate his boundless, destructive ambition. I told him clearly that a true family is built exclusively on a foundation of mutual respect, unwavering integrity, and the instinct to fiercely protect one another from the harshness of the outside world. He had actively chosen to subvert and desecrate every single one of those sacred principles. He had looked at the father who sacrificed his physical body in a blistering steel mill to feed him and saw only an obsolete, easily manipulated obstacle standing between him and a mountain of cash. He had viewed his childhood home not as a protective sanctuary filled with love, but as an exploitable corporate asset to be aggressively liquidated for his own benefit. He had happily traded his fundamental humanity for the hollow approval of ruthless venture capitalist men who had immediately abandoned him the second the federal agents breached the ballroom doors. I gripped the heavy silver receiver tightly, preparing to deliver the absolute finality of my decision. I told him explicitly that throwing his deceased mother's pristine memory and her sacred sanctuary into a blazing fire just to appease a room full of elite, greedy strangers was the unforgivable action of a parasite, not a son. I stated with unwavering firmness that not a single solitary dollar of Sylvia's hard-earned legacy would ever be used to finance his salvation, and his massive federal bail would absolutely not be paid by me. Jared screamed my name, a primal echoing sound of absolute unadulterated terror as the reality of a long prison sentence finally crushed him. I brought the receiver down heavily and severed the connection, cutting off his frantic, begging voice permanently. I reached down to the wooden baseboard near the heavy oak desk and forcefully unplugged the landline cord directly from the wall jack. Absolute perfect silence immediately reclaimed the study, wrapping around me like a protective cloak, leaving me entirely alone and entirely at peace within the impregnable fortress Sylvia and I had built together. The absolute silence in the study was profound, but as I walked out into the main corridor, the visual noise of the mansion assaulted my senses. Jared and Natalie had not merely redecorated Sylvia's sanctuary, they had violently overwritten it with a sterile, hollow extravagance. I moved through the grand living room, my boots sinking into an imported stark white fur rug that felt more like a museum exhibition than a place to rest. The walls, once painted in warm, inviting tones, were now covered in cold metallic silver wallpaper and hung with chaotic, meaningless modern art purchased solely for the exorbitant price tags attached to the canvases. Everywhere I looked, I saw Natalie's desperate, gaudy elitism reflecting back at me from oversized, gold-gilded mirrors. They had stripped the soul from the architecture, replacing the rich history of the estate with a fragile veneer of unearned luxury. The air itself felt heavy, suffocating under the weight of their pretentious ambition. I realized then that reclaiming the legal deed from Gregory Pierce was only the first step in my ultimate victory. The physical space remained deeply infected by their toxic presence. Every crystal vase and velvet chaise lounge served as a lingering monument to their greed and their betrayal. To truly secure my peace and honor, Sylvia's memory, I needed to completely eradicate their aesthetic influence from the property. I could not sleep in a house that still carried the visual echo of my son's supreme arrogance. The eradication of their empire had to be absolute, extending from the frozen bank accounts right down to the very furniture occupying the floorboards. The very next morning, precisely at 8 o'clock, a convoy of heavy-moving trucks rolled up the long, winding driveway. I had not wasted a single hour. I hired the most efficient, ruthless professional liquidation crew available in the county. I stood in the grand foyer and directed the foreman with absolute clinical precision. I instructed his men to strip the mansion bare of every ostentatious item Jared and Natalie had brought onto the property. I watched with quiet satisfaction as the workers dismantled the absurdly oversized crystal chandeliers, rolled up the pristine fur rugs, and hauled away the fragile velvet-upholstered sofas. The crew worked relentlessly, methodically purging the sterile metallic decor and carrying it out the heavy oak doors to be auctioned off. While the interior was being physically cleansed, I walked out to the expansive, climate-controlled garage. The space was filled with a fleet of high-performance luxury vehicles, including Jared's imported Italian sports cars and Natalie's custom-ordered armored SUV. I did not look at the vehicles with admiration. I looked at them as trapped liquidity. I contacted a high-end automotive broker I had vetted the night before. By noon, the broker arrived with a team of flatbed trailers and a certified bank draft. I signed the transfer titles without a shred of hesitation, watching the roaring engines be driven away permanently. The immediate aggressive liquidation of those depreciating assets served a highly specific purpose. The massive sum generated from the rapid sale of the vehicles was instantly routed directly back into my secure accounts. It precisely and entirely replenished the protected retirement funds that Jared had so callously drained to finance his fraudulent lifestyle. Sylvia and I had spent 35 years building that specific nest egg, painstakingly setting aside a portion of my union wages every single week, sacrificing vacations and new clothes to ensure we would never become a financial burden in our twilight years. Jared had wiped out 3 decades of our disciplined financial survival in a matter of days just to lease depreciating metal. Watching the flatbed trucks disappear down the road, I finally felt the deep lingering anxiety over my financial security evaporate. The stolen future was officially reclaimed. With the cavernous rooms completely emptied of their hollow extravagance, the mansion finally breathed again. The space echoed with a clean, unburdened resonance. Early that afternoon, a single, modest moving van arrived carrying the contents of my storage unit. I supervised the careful unloading of my own belongings, directing the movers to place each piece with deliberate intention. They carried in the heavy, solid oak dining table Sylvia and I had purchased at a rural flea market during our first year of marriage. We had spent countless evenings sanding and refinishing that exact wood together, building a life around its sturdy frame. They positioned my worn, comfortable leather armchair directly in front of the stone fireplace in the main living room, right where Natalie had previously installed an absurdly impractical glass sculpture. I watched them construct the solid pine bookshelves in the study, filling them with dog-eared novels and heavy historical biographies, replacing Jared's fake color-coordinated display books. The contrast was immediate and profoundly striking. The grand, soaring architecture of the estate now housed grounded, deeply meaningful items that carried the authentic weight of real life. My sturdy, practical furniture did not attempt to compete with the opulence of the vaulted ceilings. Instead, it anchored the massive rooms in absolute reality. The space no longer felt like a staged photograph designed to intimidate elite investors. It felt warm, lived in, and authentic. By replacing their fragile, expensive illusions with the solid, enduring artifacts of my actual life, I had completely neutralized the lingering toxicity of their reign. The mansion was finally transformed back into a true home. As the final moving van departed, leaving me alone in the restored tranquility of the foyer, the heavy brass doorbell chimed with a clear, resonant tone. I walked to the massive oak doors and pulled them open. Rosa Flores stood on the wide stone porch, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow across her tired but determined face. Rosa had been the head housekeeper during Jared's brief tyrannical reign, a woman who had silently endured Natalie's endless demeaning complaints to support her own family. I had always treated Rosa with the quiet respect she deserved, recognizing a fellow laborer trapped in a hostile environment. She was not wearing her stiff formal uniform today, but rather her own comfortable street clothes. In her hand, she carefully cradled a large, flat package wrapped tightly in thick brown shipping paper. Her posture was completely different from the fearful, shrinking stance she maintained whenever Natalie was in the room. She stood perfectly straight, her eyes meeting mine directly. Those eyes shone with a profound, unspoken respect, acknowledging the absolute justice that had swept through the estate the previous night. She extended her arms, handing the heavy package directly to me. I accepted the heavy, flat package from Rosa Flores, the coarse texture of the brown shipping paper grounding me instantly in the present moment. I carried the parcel carefully into the main study, placing it gently on the solid oak desk that now rightfully anchored the center of the room. Rosa followed quietly, her presence a comforting reminder of the genuine unspoken alliances I had forged in the dark shadows of my son's tyranny. My calloused fingers trembled visibly as I worked at the thick twine binding the parcel together. I knew exactly what rested inside, though my mind still fiercely resisted the miraculous possibility of its salvation. 7 months ago, during the chaotic, aggressively lavish housewarming gala Jared and Natalie had thrown to publicly celebrate their hostile takeover of the estate, a severely intoxicated guest had carelessly discarded a lit cigar near the enclosed service wing. That was the cramped, unheated space where my personal belongings had been unceremoniously dumped. The resulting fire had been extinguished before consuming the structure, but the intense heat and thick acrid smoke had severely scorched the heavy cedar chest containing Sylvia's handmade heritage quilt. I remembered pulling the blackened, ruined fabric from the toxic ashes with my bare, blistered hands, feeling completely devastated by the violent loss. The intricate patchwork had represented 3 entire years of Sylvia's painstaking labor. She had sewn scraps of Jared's childhood clothes sections of my old union work shirts and delicate ribbons from her own dresses into a massive physical tapestry of our shared history. I had locked the charred, brittle remains away in the dark, entirely convinced the fire damage from their arrogant party was absolute and irreversible. Now, as the thick brown wrapping paper finally fell away, my breath hitched painfully in my chest. The familiar, soothing scent of dried lavender and clean cotton completely replaced the lingering phantom odor of stale ash. The vibrant surviving colors of the quilt emerged under the warm light of the study, cascading beautifully across the dark wood of the desk. I ran my hand over the pristine fabric, absolutely stunned by the immaculate preservation of the central panels. The devastation I had mourned for months had been miraculously and entirely undone. Rosa stepped forward, her dark eyes reflecting a deep, knowing empathy. She watched my silent shock and began to explain the arduous process of her meticulous work. She spoke in a calm, melodic voice, detailing how she had carefully unstitched the irreparably burnt borders, salvaging every possible thread of Sylvia's original masterpiece. Rosa told me that the new, vibrant fabric patches she had carefully integrated into the design represented survival. She explained that true family heirlooms are never simply discarded when they face destruction. They are fiercely protected and painstakingly rebuilt. Her words carried a profound, undeniable truth that resonated through the quiet room. She looked directly into my eyes and stated with absolute conviction that Sylvia would be immensely proud of my unyielding strength. Rosa had witnessed my silent endurance during the darkest days of Jared's abuse. She had seen me scrub the floors and endure Natalie's constant, venomous insults without ever breaking my composure. She told me that my patience was not a sign of weakness, but a masterclass in survival. The newly integrated fabrics sourced from Rosa's own collection of sturdy, enduring textiles symbolized the resilience required to outlast a raging fire. Sylvia's spirit lived on not just in the original squares of cotton, but in the fierce determination required to mend what had been broken. Rosa's quiet validation washed over me, reinforcing the undeniable reality that I had successfully protected my wife's legacy from total annihilation. I thanked her, my voice thick with an emotion I had suppressed for far too long. She simply nodded, acknowledging the profound shared victory over the superficial greed that had nearly destroyed my family's sanctuary. I leaned over the desk, completely captivated by the fact that Rosa had masterfully restored the quilt to a state of absolute beauty. She had not merely patched the gaping holes, she had elevated the entire piece. She meticulously replaced the heavily scorched sections with fresh, durable fabric, but she had made a brilliantly artistic decision regarding the slightly singed edges. Instead of hiding the trauma the quilt had endured, she wove the faint burn marks directly into a beautiful, resilient new pattern. The dark charred edges of the original cotton were bordered with bright, flawless golden thread, highlighting the scars rather than erasing them. The damage from the fire was now framed as a permanent testament to endurance. I reached out and traced the flawless stitching with my healing, rough hands. The tactile sensation of the heavy fabric grounded me further into the reality of my reclaimed life. The seamless integration of the old familiar squares with the vibrant new additions created a breathtaking visual narrative of destruction and rebirth. The quilt was a perfect physical mirror of my own journey over the past year. Jared and Natalie had actively attempted to burn my life to the ground, leaving me in the ashes of my own home. But through meticulous planning, quiet patience, and the support of genuine allies like Rosa, I had completely rebuilt my existence. The scars of their betrayal would always remain, but those scars were now permanently surrounded by a reinforced, unyielding strength. I ran my fingertips over a patch of Sylvia's old blue dress, feeling a profound, absolute peace settle into my bones. The restoration was a masterpiece of defiance against the hollow extravagance that had temporarily infected the estate. After expressing my deepest gratitude to Rosa, I gathered the heavy restored quilt in my arms and walked up the grand sweeping staircase. I entered the expansive master suite, a room that finally felt entirely cleansed of its previous toxic occupants. I approached the sturdy oak bed I had moved in earlier that morning and carefully spread the vibrant patchwork across the mattress. The rich colors instantly warmed the massive space, anchoring the room with authentic, undeniable love. I turned and looked out the towering glass windows, surveying the sprawling, meticulously landscaped acres of the property. The absolute silence of the mansion was deeply comforting, yet the sheer immense scale of the estate was entirely too large for one man living quietly alone. The sprawling corridors and empty guest wings demanded a true purpose, a function far greater than housing a solitary widower. I walked directly to the heavy desk in the corner of the room and picked up my secure mobile phone. I dialed Arthur Sterling's direct private line. When his deep voice answered on the first ring, I did not waste time with pleasantries. I immediately presented the billionaire investor with a radical, uncompromising new business proposal. I did not offer Arthur Sterling a traditional investment opportunity. I offered him a partnership in a complete structural overhaul of my family's legacy. Sterling listened with silent intensity as I detailed my intention to permanently insulate the Sylvia Memorial Trust from any future attempts at familial extortion. I instructed Sterling to deploy his most ruthless corporate attorneys to draft ironclad stipulations that would irrevocably lock the capital away from Jared, Natalie, and any future descendants who might attempt to stake a baseless claim. The wealth was no longer a dormant prize waiting to be plundered. It was going to become an active, impenetrable fortress. Sterling immediately understood the magnitude of the directive. He agreed to sever the remaining toxic financial ties connecting my estate to Jared's liquidated tech firm, ensuring that the federal government would absorb the wreckage of my son's ambition while my assets remained entirely untouched. We finalized the strategy in under 10 minutes. The rapid, decisive nature of the call solidified my ultimate victory. I was not merely protecting a bank account. I was actively dismantling the generational curse of greed that had infected my bloodline. By removing the financial incentive, I removed the target from my back. No relative could ever again view me as an obsolete hurdle standing between them and a mountain of cash. The money was officially out of reach, legally bound, and purposefully redirected. My reclaimed wealth would serve a higher master than superficial luxury. The core of this new legal structure required a definitive purpose, a mission that honored the architect of my survival. I instructed Gregory Pierce to formally establish the Sylvia Foundation for Elder Protection. Watching Gregory draft the initial incorporation papers, I found a profound, overwhelming sense of ultimate peace. Sylvia had possessed a quiet genius that far surpassed any boardroom strategy or venture capital scheme. During the long, quiet evenings of our marriage, while she carefully repaired the torn seams of my work jackets, she would often speak about the inherent vulnerability of the elderly. She had witnessed her own parents be systematically manipulated by distant relatives, watching helplessly as their modest savings were siphoned away under the guise of familial assistance. She knew intimately how easily greed could rot a family from the inside out. That childhood trauma had shaped her immense foresight. It was the exact reason she had secretly partnered with Gregory years ago to construct the blind trust that ultimately saved my life. She had anticipated Jared's corruption long before it manifested into a federal crime. Naming the foundation in her honor was not merely a sentimental gesture. It was a formal declaration of her victory over the predators of the world. Her quiet intellect, forged in the fires of personal hardship, would now serve as a permanent shield for thousands of vulnerable citizens who lacked the resources to defend themselves. The foundation would seek out those who were being silenced, manipulated, and financially drained by the people they trusted most. Knowing that Sylvia's enduring empathy would actively dismantle the schemes of abusers brought a warmth to my chest that I had not felt in years. Her legacy would not be a sterile marble monument or an empty bank account. Her legacy would be a vast active network of protection, ensuring her brilliant foresight continued to save lives long after we were both gone. The physical transformation of the estate proceeded with the same relentless efficiency as the legal restructuring. I completely repurposed the sprawling mansion, legally transforming the massive property into the operational headquarters for the foundation. The cavernous rooms that Jared had designed to host elitist galas were rapidly converted into functional workspaces. The grand dining hall became a collaborative meeting center for a dedicated team of pro bono attorneys and social workers. The expansive library, once filled with hollow decorative books, now housed comprehensive legal archives dedicated to prosecuting elder financial abuse. To fund this massive endeavor, I utilized every single dollar recovered from the corporate fraud lawsuit against Jared's liquidated firm. The millions of dollars he had ruthlessly embezzled to fund his arrogant lifestyle were systematically seized, sanitized by the federal courts, and injected directly into the charity. The poetic justice was absolute. The very funds Jared had stolen to oppress me were now actively paying the salaries of fierce legal advocates dedicated to hunting down men exactly like him. The mansion was no longer a gilded cage or a monument to toxic ambition. It was a bustling, vibrant command center fighting on the front lines of justice. The estate radiated with a renewed vital energy. Every ringing telephone and every hushed legal consultation echoing through the hallways represented another vulnerable life being pulled from the brink of ruin. I had taken the weapon Jared forged to destroy me and turned it into an instrument of profound salvation. I stepped out onto the grand stone patio as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. I lowered myself into a sturdy, handcrafted wooden rocking chair I had brought from my original home. The crisp morning air carried the scent of damp earth and fresh pine. I held a simple chipped ceramic mug in my hands, letting the steam from the strong black coffee warm my face. The morning sun illuminated the sprawling estate, casting long golden shadows across the meticulously maintained lawns. The massive property stretched out before me, completely secure, fully reclaimed, and entirely mine. The silence surrounding me was profound. It was not the fearful, suffocating silence of a victim trapped in a basement. It was not the tense, uncomfortable silence of a man walking on eggshells around his own son. It was the absolute, unshakable silence of a man who had fought a brutal war without firing a single shot and won back his fundamental dignity. I took a slow sip of the bitter coffee, watching the sunlight chase away the last remnants of the darkness. My silent adjustment was finally complete. True strength is never measured by the volume of your anger or the cruelty of your revenge. It is measured by your capacity to endure betrayal, protect your peace, and meticulously rebuild your life on your own terms. Family is a title earned through unwavering respect and mutual protection, not a biological right that permits endless exploitation. When faced with absolute greed, the most devastating response is not a screaming argument, but a quiet, calculated removal of access. Reclaiming your dignity requires realizing that your ultimate worth is never dictated by those who only view you as an exploitable resource. Have you ever had to set impossible boundaries to protect your own peace? Share your story of quiet strength in the comments below, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more tales of resilience, justice, and reclaimed dignity.